Oliver Cromwell's life is one of the most fascinating and contentious chapters in English history. A soldier, politician, and devout Puritan, Cromwell played a pivotal role in the English Civil War, the execution of King Charles I, and the establishment of the Commonwealth, where he served as Lord Protector. His vision for England, a republic based on godly principles, was both revolutionary and radical for its time, challenging the monarchy's centuries-old grip on power. Yet, despite his significant achievements and his commitment to religious and political reform, Cromwell's leadership was marked by deep contradictions. His pursuit of justice, liberty, and religious purity often led to authoritarian rule, religious intolerance, and military conquest, creating a legacy that is as divisive as it is transformative. Cromwell's story is a profound exploration of the tension between ideals and reality, ambition and morality, and the complex burden of leadership. If you found Cromwell's story intriguing, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on more fascinating historical journeys.
Oliver Cromwell's Rest, a reflection on power and legacy. Oliver Cromwell, a figure whose name is often synonymous with the English Civil War and the establishment of the Commonwealth of England, remains one of the most controversial leaders in British history. His rise to power was not only a military conquest, but a reshaping of the political landscape of England, influencing the future of the British monarchy and parliamentary system. Cromwell's actions, from his leadership in the execution of King Charles I to his eventual rule as Lord Protector, had profound effects on the nation and the world. However, the story of Cromwell is not just one of power and rebellion, it is also one of rest and reflection. Oliver Cromwell's rest, metaphorically speaking, comes not only in the sense of personal respite, but also in the reflective pause in the history he left behind. After the Civil War and the execution of Charles I, Cromwell took control as the leader of the Commonwealth, seeking to implement his vision of a republic. But despite his successes, Cromwell's tenure was far from peaceful. His rule was marked by ongoing military campaigns, including the conquest of Ireland and Scotland, and his imposition of puritanical reforms that alienated many. The turmoil of his reign, both political and personal, might have led Cromwell to seek some form of rest, not just for his body, but for his conscience. Throughout his life, Cromwell wrestled with the dualities of power and humility, justice and tyranny, piety and militarism. As a devout Puritan, he saw himself as an instrument of divine will, but the weight of his decisions, especially the violent and controversial ones, must have weighed heavily on him. One of the more poignant aspects of Cromwell's story is the notion that he never truly rested, even in death. After his death in 1658, Cromwell was buried with great ceremony, but his legacy was not so easily laid to rest. The monarchy was restored just a few years later under Charles II, and Cromwell's body was exhumed and subjected to a posthumous execution, a symbolic act that reflected the profound division in English society about his place in history. The rest that Cromwell sought was never truly his, for the very actions he took to bring about a new order of governance would continue to haunt the nation long after his passing. In his own lifetime, Cromwell's rest was elusive. His actions as a military leader and a political figure were driven by an uncompromising vision of a godly society, but this vision came at a great personal cost. Cromwell faced numerous challenges during his time in power, ranging from internal political strife to military engagements, and each required a significant investment of energy, resolve, and sacrifice. His deep sense of duty and belief in his divine mandate to govern undoubtedly fueled his resolve, but also left him weary, a man burdened with the weight of decisions that would define a nation. Cromwell's pursuit of a republic in the face of monarchy was a monumental act of defiance against centuries of royal rule, and yet, in the end, the monarchy was restored.
This moment of apparent failure can be seen as a kind of rest for the British political system, a return to the established order that had been disrupted by the Civil War and the interregnum. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 symbolized the end of Cromwell's experiment in republicanism, but it also marked a period of relative peace and stability for England. For many, this restoration of monarchy provided the rest that Cromwell had been unable to secure in his lifetime. However, the legacy of Oliver Cromwell cannot be easily dismissed. His impact on English society was profound, not only because of his political and military achievements, but also because of the way he shaped the discourse surrounding the relationship between monarchy and parliamentary power. Even after the restoration of the monarchy, Cromwell's actions and the events of the English Civil War continued to resonate throughout British history. The conflict between monarchists and republicans would persist, shaping the development of the British political system for generations. In reflecting on Cromwell's life and legacy, one can see that his quest for rest was more than just a personal need. It was an ideological struggle that mirrored the broader political tensions of his time. Cromwell's rest, in the end, was never fully realized, neither in his lifetime nor after his death. His story is one of relentless struggle, where moments of respite were fleeting and always overshadowed by the larger forces at play. However, this struggle itself speaks to the complexities of leadership, power, and legacy. It is a reminder that the pursuit of rest, in both the physical and metaphorical sense, is often elusive for those who seek to change the course of history. Oliver Cromwell's rest, therefore, is a symbol of the challenges that come with leadership and the weight of historical responsibility. His life was a complex intertwining of power, faith, and conflict, and while he may have longed for peace, his legacy remains a subject of debate and reflection. For history, like the man himself, finds rest only in the eventual resolution of the struggles that define it. Cromwell's life, marked by his unyielding vision of a new political order, continues to reverberate through the halls of British history, never fully resting, never fully settled.
Oliver Cromwell's legacy, though marked by turbulence and conflict, cannot be understood without recognizing the underlying themes of restlessness that permeated his entire life. From the moment he took up arms against the monarchy to his death and the eventual restoration of the monarchy, Cromwell's life was a constant clash of ideals, ambitions, and political realities. In his quest to reform England and reshape its governance, he found himself perpetually in a state of struggle, never able to experience the peace and resolution he so deeply desired. This continuous turmoil may have led him to a state of weariness, a man who fought for a vision of a godly republic, but was ultimately swept away by forces beyond his control. After the death of King Charles I in 1649, Cromwell took up the mantle of leadership during one of the most turbulent periods in English history. As a military commander, he led the new model army to victory in the Civil War, defeating the Royalists and paving the way for the establishment of the Commonwealth. But Cromwell's vision for England was not merely about overthrowing the monarchy. He sought to create a society based on Puritan values, where the power of the state would be restrained by a godly government, and the people would live according to biblical principles. Yet even as he built this new political order, Cromwell struggled with the very forces of power he was trying to control. The political structure he created was fraught with instability. Parliamentary factions constantly challenged his authority, and military campaigns, such as the brutal conquest of Ireland, proved divisive and left a trail of resentment. While Cromwell considered himself an instrument of divine will, his policies alienated many who believed that the harshness of his rule conflicted with the very ideals of justice and mercy that Puritans espoused. His vision for a godly republic was not universally shared, and many saw Cromwell's actions as tyrannical rather than righteous. As the years of his rule passed, Cromwell's desire for rest grew more evident. Though his reign was characterized by a high level of activity and military conflict, there were moments when he sought a retreat from the burdens of leadership.
Some of these moments can be seen in his attempts to distance himself from the day-to-day operations of the Commonwealth government, as he began to focus more on spiritual matters. Cromwell's retreat into religious reflection can be viewed as a form of rest, albeit a restless one. He often sought solace in prayer and meditation, wrestling with the tension between his duty as a political leader and his spiritual role as a man of faith. Yet the political landscape of England offered no respite. Cromwell's death in 1658 did not bring closure to his tumultuous journey. His son, Richard Cromwell, briefly took the title of Lord Protector, but lacked the political skill and military backing of his father. The country descended into chaos, and just 2 years later, the monarchy was restored, with Charles II taking the throne. The restoration marked the undoing of much of what Cromwell had fought for, and the political system he had tried to establish was swept away in favor of the monarchy. In an ironic twist, Cromwell's rest was denied even after his death. In 1661, Cromwell's exhumed body was put on trial posthumously by the newly restored monarchy. His body was hanged, beheaded, and thrown into a pit, a symbolic gesture that sought to erase his legacy. As though the monarchy could not tolerate the reminder of Cromwell's challenge to the established order, and his death was an attempt to remove his influence once and for all. The posthumous execution of Cromwell became a powerful symbol of the divide between the monarchists and the republicans, and it ensured that his legacy would remain a topic of debate and reflection long after his passing. However, despite this act of desecration, Cromwell's legacy could not be so easily extinguished. In the years that followed, the English people continued to grapple with the implications of his rule. Though the monarchy was restored, the memory of the English Civil War and the rise of republicanism left an indelible mark on the national consciousness. Cromwell's actions, whether viewed as tyrannical or visionary, played a central role in the shaping of modern Britain. His experiment in republicanism, while short-lived, had long-term implications for the relationship between the monarchy and Parliament, influencing debates on governance and the rights of the people that would continue for centuries. The desire for rest, both for Cromwell and for England, was never fully realized. The conflict between monarchy and republicanism, though temporarily settled with the restoration of the monarchy, would continue to resonate in British political life. Cromwell's legacy lived on in the political upheavals that followed, in the debates over the limits of royal power, and in the eventual development of constitutional monarchy. Even in his absence, the struggle he initiated would continue to shape the course of English history. Cromwell's story is ultimately one of restless pursuit, of power, of faith, and of a new political order. His life, marked by relentless struggle and deep ideological conviction, stands as a testament to the complexities of leadership and the high cost of political ambition. In seeking to create a better society, he found himself entangled in contradictions that would haunt him to the end. And in the end, even his death did not bring him rest. His legacy, whether loved or reviled, endures as one of the most fascinating and contentious chapters in the history of Britain. Thus, Oliver Cromwell's rest is a paradox, a man who sought peace but was forever driven by the demands of his vision. A leader whose death did not end his influence, and a legacy that continues to inspire debate, reflection, and even discord in the centuries following his reign. The rest he sought, both in life and death, was never truly his, and perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of his life. In the pursuit of greatness, rest often remains an inattainable goal.
As we delve deeper into the life and legacy of Oliver Cromwell, the complex interplay between his political actions, personal struggles, and the broader historical context becomes even more apparent. The rest that Cromwell sought throughout his life, a respite from the endless political battles, military campaigns, and the burden of his leadership, remained elusive. His story illustrates how the weight of history can rob even the most ambitious of individuals from finding true peace, whether in life or death. One of the most striking elements of Cromwell's journey was the way in which he navigated the realms of both religion and politics. He saw himself as a servant of God, believing that he was divinely appointed to carry out the task of purging England of its monarchy and creating a godly republic. For Cromwell, the pursuit of a new political order was intertwined with his deep religious convictions. As a devout Puritan, he genuinely believed that England's woes could be remedied through a return to biblical principles. This vision led him to take decisive action against King Charles I, whose refusal to accept the authority of Parliament in matters of governance was seen by Cromwell and his supporters as a betrayal of God's will. In this sense, Cromwell's rise to power was not simply an act of rebellion, it was a religious crusade. However, the very zeal that fueled his ascent to power also became the source of his inner turmoil. Cromwell's actions, particularly his military campaigns in Ireland, are often viewed as harsh and brutal, leading to significant loss of life and widespread resentment. The massacre at Drogheda in 1649, where Cromwell's forces killed thousands of Irish soldiers and civilians, is one of the darkest chapters of his legacy. This ruthless approach to securing his vision of England as a godly nation was deeply unsettling to many, even among his supporters. For Cromwell, the pursuit of righteousness and the enforcement of divine justice sometimes meant resorting to violence, a contradiction that must have troubled him on a personal level. The paradox of Cromwell's legacy is that while he sought rest, peace, and stability for England, his actions often sowed the seeds of future unrest. His military conquests and his uncompromising vision of governance led to divisions within his own country. By the time of his death in 1658, England was divided, with various factions vying for control and influence. Cromwell's rule, though significant, was marked by constant struggle. He could not achieve the restful serenity that he sought, not because of a lack of effort or vision, but because the very nature of his political and military actions made such peace unattainable. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 under Charles II was both a moment of political rebirth and a repudiation of the Commonwealth experiment. For many, the restoration of the monarchy symbolized a return to normalcy and stability after the years of upheaval that Cromwell's rise to power had unleashed. But for others, the restoration was seen as a betrayal of the ideals that Cromwell had fought for, a confirmation that England's political system would ultimately revert to its traditional royal structure. In this sense, Cromwell's vision for a republic, though short-lived, had a lasting impact on the political discourse of the time. It raised critical questions about the nature of authority, the balance of power between Parliament and the monarchy, and the relationship between the state and religion. Yet Cromwell's desire for rest, whether in the form of peace for England or a personal reprieve from the burdens of leadership, was never realized. His life, even after death, was marked by controversy. The exhumation of his body and its subsequent posthumous execution in 1661 was an act of symbolic vengeance by those who opposed his republican ideals. His body was hanged and beheaded, and his head was displayed on a pole as a warning to those who would defy the monarchy. This act, in many ways, was the final denial of Cromwell's vision, as it sought to erase his influence from the national consciousness. Yet this act of desecration could not fully eliminate the imprint Cromwell left on history. While his body was destroyed, the ideas he championed, such as the power of Parliament, the role of religion in governance, and the idea of a republic, remained embedded in the political fabric of Britain. The restoration of the monarchy did not mark the end of republican ideas. Rather, it created a more complex political environment where debates about the nature of governance continued to evolve.
Cromwell's actions and legacy set the stage for later political developments, including the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which would see the establishment of a constitutional monarchy in England. Moreover, Cromwell's legacy was not confined to the borders of England. His rise to power and his implementation of a Puritan government inspired similar movements in other parts of the world. In particular, Cromwell's actions influenced the American colonies, where Republican ideals were taking root in the 1600s. The ideas of representative government and the rejection of absolute monarchy found fertile ground in the New World, ultimately contributing to the American Revolution a century later. In this way, Cromwell's legacy transcended his own time and place, affecting the course of global history. Cromwell's rest, however, was never found, not in life and not in death. His personal struggles, his commitment to a vision that was at once revolutionary and deeply controversial, ensured that his legacy would remain a subject of debate for generations to come. The rest he sought was elusive, for it could never come while his actions continued to reverberate through history. His political career, marked by both triumph and failure, shows that true rest for those who reshape the world is often a distant dream, forever out of reach.
As we continue to explore Oliver Cromwell's life, it becomes increasingly clear that his story is not just about political power or religious conviction, but also about the human struggle to reconcile ideals with the harsh realities of governance. His legacy is a reflection of the tensions between what is desired and what is achievable, and the consequences of trying to impose one's will on a complex and often unwilling society. The burden of leadership and the struggle for rest. Cromwell's leadership was shaped by his belief that he had a divine mandate to reform England. He saw himself as a chosen instrument of God, tasked with bringing about a new political order that would be in line with Puritan values. This sense of religious duty propelled him into the forefront of English politics, leading his troops against the Royalists during the English Civil War, ultimately securing the execution of King Charles I in 1649. The execution was not just a political act, but for Cromwell, a spiritual one, an act of purging what he saw as a corrupt monarchy in favor of a godly republic. However, this act of spiritual and political righteousness also marked the beginning of a long, unrelenting battle, not just against the monarchy, but against his own inner doubts. Despite his military success, Cromwell found that leading a nation was a far more complex task than simply defeating an enemy. Establishing the Commonwealth, a republic free from the rule of monarchy, was far from the idealistic vision Cromwell had imagined. The political landscape of England was fragmented, with numerous factions holding different views on governance, religion, and society. Cromwell's attempt to impose a Puritan theocracy alienated many, and his rule was often marked by military repression, economic strain, and political strife. This forced Cromwell to continually fight to maintain control and legitimacy, never allowing him the rest he so desperately sought. His inability to rest was not just due to the opposition he faced from royalists and parliamentarians, but also from the pressures within his own ranks. His supporters in Parliament were divided between those who wanted a more moderate form of republicanism and those who sought more radical reforms. Cromwell, whose military success had made him the unquestioned leader of the Commonwealth, found himself caught between the demands of radical Puritans, the discontent of moderates, and the need to maintain control over the army. The tensions between these groups became increasingly difficult to manage, with Cromwell finding himself constantly at odds with Parliament and, at times, taking drastic actions to dissolve it and reassert his authority. Cromwell's personal restlessness was also evident in his relentless military campaigns. After the execution of Charles I, he launched a series of military expeditions, most notably the conquest of Ireland, which remains one of the most controversial aspects of his legacy.
Cromwell's forces committed atrocities during their campaigns, particularly the massacre at Drogheda, where thousands of civilians and soldiers were killed. This act of violence, justified by Cromwell as a necessary measure to secure the future of the Commonwealth, marked the paradox at the heart of his leadership. While he sought to establish a righteous society, he did so through means that were often brutal and deeply divisive. The moral cost of these actions must have weighed heavily on him, further complicating his desire for rest. The restlessness of ideals. The very ideals that Cromwell fought for also contributed to his inability to find peace. His belief in the necessity of a godly republic was deeply personal, rooted in his faith and his vision for what England could become. However, this idealistic vision was often at odds with the realities of governance. Cromwell found himself caught in a cycle of compromise and conflict as he attempted to balance his religious convictions with the pragmatic needs of running a state. Cromwell's establishment of the Protectorate was supposed to provide the stability that England needed after the upheaval of the Civil War, but in many ways it created more division. The puritanical reforms he implemented, such as restrictions on public entertainment, the closing of theaters, and the imposition of moral laws, alienated many sections of society. Cromwell's government was not seen as a unifying force, but as a regime that imposed its own values on a society that was not universally willing to accept them. This clash between Cromwell's ideals and the broader society's realities reflected the deeper struggles within his own heart. On one hand, he was deeply committed to his Puritan faith and believed that his actions were divinely guided. On the other hand, he had to deal with the political and social complexities of a nation that was not entirely on board with his vision. His sense of duty to God and country led him to take actions that, in hindsight, seemed contradictory, seeking peace through war, advocating for religious freedom while imposing strict moral codes, and attempting to create stability through authoritarian rule. Cromwell's struggle to reconcile these contradictions within himself made it impossible for him to find the rest he sought. The aftermath. Cromwell's legacy. Cromwell's death in 1658 did not bring closure to his tumultuous legacy. Following his death, the country remained in a state of flux. His son, Richard Cromwell, was unable to maintain the power and authority that his father had commanded, and within 2 years the monarchy was restored under Charles II. This restoration effectively ended the republican experiment that Cromwell had fought so hard to establish, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in British history, one that would eventually lead to the establishment of a constitutional monarchy. Despite the monarchy's return, Cromwell's influence continued to reverberate throughout English politics. His time as Lord Protector had laid the foundation for later debates about the balance of power between the monarchy and Parliament, as well as the role of religion in government. The ideas that Cromwell championed, the supremacy of Parliament, the need for checks on royal power, and the potential for a republic, continued to shape British political thought even after the monarchy was restored. In the centuries following his death, Cromwell's legacy was the subject of intense debate. For some, he was a hero, a champion of liberty and democracy who sought to overthrow the tyranny of the monarchy. For others, he was a tyrant, a military dictator who imposed his religious and political views on an unwilling nation. The restoration of Charles II did not erase Cromwell's memory. In fact, the very act of posthumously executing his body after his death demonstrated to the extent to which Cromwell's actions had divided English society. Even after his body was desecrated and his name maligned, Cromwell's vision for a more representative government continued to influence future generations. His legacy can be seen in the development of modern parliamentary democracy and in the broader republican movements that spread throughout Europe and the Americas. In this sense, Cromwell's rest was never truly achieved. He may have longed for peace and stability, but the very nature of his actions, the revolution he sparked, ensured that his legacy would remain a subject of ongoing reflection, debate, and division. Oliver Cromwell's life and legacy continue to elicit both admiration and scorn. His enduring influence on the development of England, and indeed on the political systems of many nations, attests to the depth of his historical significance. Yet it is impossible to overlook the moral and ideological contradictions that marked his life. The rest that he sought, both in his personal life and within the broader context of his political rule, remained elusive and unattainable, leaving us to wonder if true peace was ever within his grasp. Cromwell's relationship with power, a man torn between duty and personal desires. Cromwell's thirst for power cannot be understated. He was not born into nobility, nor was he destined to become a monarch. However, through the bloody and tumultuous course of the English Civil War, he ascended to a position of remarkable influence, ultimately assuming the role of Lord Protector. His rise was driven by a combination of military skill, religious conviction, and sheer determination. But Cromwell's relationship with power was fraught with complexities. At times, Cromwell appeared as a reluctant ruler, a man who had not initially sought the throne, but had been thrust into leadership by the course of events. His ascension to the Lord Protectorate was not accompanied by the lavish celebrations typical of a monarch's coronation. Instead, it was a reluctant acceptance of a duty that he believed had been ordained by God. Yet this belief in his divine calling gave rise to a tension between personal ambition and public duty, a struggle that would continue throughout his time in power. Despite his own self-perception as a man fulfilling a divine mission, Cromwell's reign was far from serene. The political landscape in England was still deeply fractured, with factions loyal to the monarchy, radical Republicans, and moderates all vying for power. As Lord Protector, Cromwell was forced to navigate these competing forces while simultaneously maintaining control over the army, which had been the foundation of his power. His reliance on the military became a double-edged sword. While the military ensured his dominance, it also meant that his rule was never fully legitimized by the people or the political establishment. The military presence in everyday life, combined with Cromwell's authoritarian measures, contributed to a sense of unease and dissatisfaction. Cromwell's desire to impose a puritanical moral order on England made him unpopular with a large portion of the population. While his religious convictions guided much of his policy-making, many saw his attempts to legislate morality as a form of tyranny. Puritanical laws prohibiting theater performances, dancing, and other forms of entertainment were deeply resented by those who longed for a more tolerant and diverse society. In trying to impose religious purity, Cromwell's regime became a source of discomfort and resistance. In this way, Cromwell's political actions often contradicted the very rest he sought. The more he sought to control and impose his ideals, the more resistant the population became, creating an endless cycle of tension and conflict. Cromwell's personal struggles, a man at odds with himself. Despite the grandeur of his public role, Cromwell was also a deeply personal figure, one whose inner struggles are often overlooked in discussions of his political career. He was a man of great faith, constantly grappling with the burden of his religious beliefs and the personal cost of his actions. This tension was particularly evident in his military campaigns, especially in Ireland, where the conquest was brutal and left a legacy of bitterness that would last for generations. Cromwell's religious beliefs were central to his identity, and he saw himself as an instrument of God's will. However, the violent means by which he sought to achieve his political goals often conflicted with his personal beliefs about justice and morality. The massacre at Drogheda, where thousands of Irish soldiers and civilians were killed, is perhaps the most infamous example of this contradiction. Cromwell justified the violence as necessary to secure the future of the Commonwealth, but the atrocity left a stain on his conscience that would haunt him. Despite his religious convictions, Cromwell was forced to reconcile the brutality of war with his vision of a godly and just society. This internal conflict likely contributed to the emotional and psychological toll of his leadership. Moreover, Cromwell's personal ambition and desire for power were also tempered by moments of doubt and reflection. At times, he sought solace in prayer, attempting to reconcile his actions with his faith. In his private moments, Cromwell must have questioned whether the price of his success, both in terms of the bloodshed he had caused and the personal sacrifices he had made, was truly worth the goal he had set out to achieve. His letters and speeches often convey a sense of weariness, suggesting that the weight of his responsibilities and the moral dilemmas he faced took a significant toll on his personal well-being. Despite his public persona as a man of resolve and unwavering conviction, Cromwell's private life was undoubtedly marked by internal turmoil. His ambition and his devotion to his religious ideals often led him into difficult decisions that could never be undone. The consequences of these decisions, both in terms of the lives lost and the political divisions created, were a constant reminder of the cost of power. Cromwell's pursuit of rest, both for himself and for his country, was thwarted by the very nature of his leadership, which required constant vigilance, compromise, and sacrifice. Cromwell's death and the return to the monarchy, a failed vision. Cromwell's death in 1958 did not bring an end to the struggles that defined his life. His son, Richard Cromwell, briefly succeeded him as Lord Protector, but he lacked the strength, charisma, and political savvy of his father. As a result, the Commonwealth quickly began to unravel, and within 2 years the monarchy was restored under Charles II. The restoration of the monarchy was a direct repudiation of Cromwell's vision for England. It signaled that the Republican experiment had failed, and the English people were willing to return to the old political order, even if it meant re-establishing the monarchy. However, Cromwell's legacy did not fade with the return of the monarchy. The debates he had ignited about the nature of governance, the role of the monarchy, and the relationship between the state and religion persisted for generations. The restoration of the monarchy may have marked the end of Cromwell's political experiment, but it also laid the groundwork for future reforms and constitutional developments in England. The Glorious Revolution of 1888, which led to the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, can be seen as the culmination of the ideas and tensions Cromwell had helped to expose during his rule. Even in the wake of the monarchy's return, Cromwell's influence continued to shape the trajectory of English politics. Cromwell's rest, the rest that was never attained. The paradox of Cromwell's life is that despite his many accomplishments, he never truly attained the rest he sought. His rule was defined by relentless struggle, both externally against political opponents and internally against his own doubts and contradictions. Cromwell's attempt to impose a puritanical vision of society left him at odds with many of his fellow countrymen, and the use of military force to achieve political ends made it impossible for him to create the peaceful, just society he had envisioned. Even in death, Cromwell's quest for rest was denied. His body was exhumed and desecrated in a posthumous execution, an act of symbolic vengeance by the restored monarchy. This final indignity seemed to represent the culmination of a life that was never allowed to rest, even after death. Yet, despite this attempt to erase his influence, Cromwell's ideas continued to resonate throughout English history, shaping debates about the role of monarchy, the relationship between church and state, and the nature of republicanism. Cromwell's story, ultimately, is one of restless pursuit. His life was marked by a constant striving for political and religious change, but he could never fully escape the consequences of his actions. The rest that he sought, whether in his personal life or within the context of his political vision, was forever out of reach. His legacy serves as a reminder that in the pursuit of power and ideals, rest may be the one thing that can never be attained. In this sense, Cromwell's life is both a triumph and a tragedy, a tale of a man who sought to change the world but was never able to find peace within it.
6. Oliver Cromwell's life is a narrative brimming with contradictions, struggles, and complexities. His pursuit of political transformation and religious righteousness made him one of the most consequential figures in English history, yet it also subjected him to a constant conflict between his personal values and the harsh realities of leadership. Cromwell's actions, his military conquests, political maneuvers, and attempts to reshape English society were driven by a profound sense of duty and religious conviction. Yet throughout his life and beyond his death, his quest for rest, peace, and fulfillment remained elusive, overshadowed by the very forces he sought to control. Cromwell's vision for England. A republic in the name of God. Cromwell's vision of England was shaped by his Puritan faith, which saw the nation as a place where God's laws should be paramount. He believed that the monarchy, as it had been embodied by the reign of Charles I, was inherently corrupt, and that it was his divine calling to establish a government that would be more in line with biblical principles. Cromwell was not just seeking political power. He saw his mission as part of a larger divine struggle. This religious fervor imbued his leadership with a sense of righteousness, yet it also alienated large sections of the population who did not share his beliefs. His ambition to create a godly republic required more than just the removal of King Charles I. It demanded a complete rethinking of England's political structure. As Lord Protector, Cromwell attempted to implement a government that he believed was divinely ordained, a government that would allow the nation to flourish spiritually. But his efforts were often met with resistance, both from those who remained loyal to the monarchy and from those who felt his rule was too authoritarian. The religiously motivated nature of Cromwell's rule added an additional layer of complexity to his leadership. In attempting to enforce religious uniformity, Cromwell enacted laws that limited personal freedoms, such as bans on Christmas celebrations and restrictions on theaters and public entertainment. These measures, though in line with his vision of a godly society, were deeply unpopular and created resentment. Cromwell's attempts to impose a moral order on England had the unintended effect of fostering division rather than unity, making it harder for him to achieve the peace and rest he longed for. The burden of leadership, from hero to tyrant. Cromwell's ascent to power was anything but conventional. He was a man who rose from relatively modest beginnings and carved himself a place in the annals of history through sheer force of will. As the leader of the new model army, Cromwell displayed extraordinary military skill, which played a pivotal role in the defeat of the Royalists during the English Civil War. His success on the battlefield earned him the loyalty of his troops and the respect of his supporters, but it also made him an immensely powerful figure. However, with power came immense responsibility, and Cromwell's leadership was marked by continuous struggle. After the execution of Charles I, Cromwell sought to establish the Commonwealth, a republic that would replace the monarchy. But despite his revolutionary aims, Cromwell soon found that leadership was more challenging than he had anticipated. He was thrust into a leadership vacuum that had few precedents and no clear path forward. His attempt to rule as Lord Protector was often seen as a form of military dictatorship, which contradicted the ideals of a free republic. While Cromwell sought to create a just, godly society, his methods were often at odds with his own ideals.
In his quest to secure power, he was forced to make difficult decisions that, in many cases, were at odds with his Christian beliefs. His campaigns in Ireland and Scotland, for example, were brutal, and many of the atrocities committed by his forces during the wars were justified in terms of political necessity. Cromwell's actions in these campaigns, particularly the massacre at Drogheda, where thousands of Irish civilians and soldiers were killed, are often cited as examples of his tyrannical approach to leadership. Though he believed his actions were necessary for the greater good, the moral cost of such decisions led many to view him as a ruthless dictator, not the liberator he had hoped to be remembered as. This contradiction between his desire to establish a godly republic and the reality of his authoritarian rule became a defining feature of Cromwell's leadership. His personal devotion to his faith and his desire to create a more just society were overshadowed by the need to maintain power and control. His reliance on the military to uphold his rule, coupled with his moral certainty, made it difficult for him to achieve the stability and peace he so desperately sought. The struggle for rest, a life of inner conflict. Cromwell's internal struggle was not just one of political and military conflict, but a deeply personal battle between his ideals and the realities of his rule. As a devout Puritan, he viewed his role as Lord Protector as one of divine appointment, and he often expressed his belief that his actions were guided by God. But despite his religious devotion, Cromwell was deeply conflicted by the violence and coercion that he often had to resort to in order to achieve his goals. He was a man whose private prayers and reflections were marked by a deep sense of moral unease as he grappled with the tension between his faith and his political actions. The irony is that Cromwell's attempts to bring rest to England, in both a political and spiritual sense, were met with more unrest. His uncompromising vision for a republic led to further division within England, as Royalists, Republicans, and Puritans all clashed over the future of the nation. His personal longing for peace and resolution was often overshadowed by the continuous demands of leadership. Cromwell, though constantly seeking solace through prayer and spiritual reflection, could never find the peace he sought. His later years were marked by weariness, both physical and emotional. By the time of his death in 1558, Cromwell had become a figure both revered and despised, admired for his military prowess and his commitment to a godly republic, yet criticized for the authoritarian nature of his rule and the violence he had condoned. The toll of his leadership, physically, morally, and psychologically, was evident in his declining health. Despite his deep sense of religious duty, Cromwell was a man who had given everything to a cause that in the end could not bring him rest. The aftermath of his death, a legacy that would not rest. Cromwell's death in 1558 marked the end of an era, but it did not bring an end to the debate over his legacy. His son, Richard, who briefly succeeded him, lacked the authority and political acumen to maintain control, and the monarchy was restored just 2 years later. The restoration of Charles II was a repudiation of the Commonwealth experiment, a return to the monarchy that Cromwell had fought so hard to abolish. But Cromwell's legacy could not be so easily erased. In 1661, his body was exhumed and publicly desecrated by the monarchy as a symbolic act of vengeance. His body was hung, beheaded, and displayed on a pole, a final insult to the man who had tried to reshape England. Yet, even in death, Cromwell's legacy persisted. His vision for a republic, his struggle for religious reform, and his military campaigns left an indelible mark on British politics.
The monarchy may have been restored, but Cromwell's influence continued to shape debates about governance, power, and the role of the monarchy in England. The conflicts he ignited and the ideas he championed were far from forgotten, continuing to influence the political development of England for centuries. Rest, reflection, and legacy. In many ways, Cromwell's life and legacy serve as a reminder that the pursuit of greatness, whether political, religious, or personal, comes at a high cost. Cromwell sought rest in the form of peace for England, a more just society, and spiritual solace. But throughout his life, he was never able to achieve this rest. His actions, though motivated by noble ideals, created lasting division and turmoil. His relentless pursuit of power, while driven by a sense of divine calling, ultimately resulted in an authoritarian regime that contradicted the very principles of freedom and justice he sought to establish. In the end, Cromwell's legacy is not of peace or rest, but of restless ambition and the consequences of trying to reshape the course of history. His life was marked.
As we delve further into Oliver Cromwell's life and legacy, the complexities of his character and the contradictions inherent in his rule become ever more apparent. Cromwell's quest for power, religious righteousness, and peace was never truly realized, and his legacy remains a reminder of the complexities of leadership, faith, and governance. His story is one of ambition, moral conflict, and the relentless pursuit of an ideal that ultimately eluded him. His leadership continues to stir debates about the nature of political authority, the intersection of religion and governance, and the costs of transformative change. Cromwell's political ideals, a vision of republic and liberty. At the core of Cromwell's ambition was his vision of an ideal republic, one in which power was vested in the hands of the people through an elected parliament, and the monarchy was abolished in favor of a godly government. Cromwell was driven by the belief that the monarchy, embodied by Charles I, was a corrupt institution that stood in opposition to the will of God. The execution of Charles I in 1649 was not merely a political act for Cromwell. It was a symbolic purge of what he saw as a deeply flawed and tyrannical regime. He believed that England could only thrive if it abandoned monarchy and embraced a more representative, godly form of governance. However, while Cromwell sought to establish a republic, his version of government was highly authoritarian. His rise to power was primarily due to his leadership of the new model army, and once he gained control, he consolidated power within his own hands, often bypassing or dissolving Parliament when it resisted his decisions. Though he attempted to set up a representative government, Cromwell's rule was marked by military influence, and his reliance on the army for political control meant that his government was far from the ideal of a free and democratic republic. Cromwell's political ideal of liberty and freedom was paradoxically intertwined with authoritarianism. In his pursuit of a godly republic, he often resorted to the very tactics of control and centralization that he had condemned under the monarchy. This contradiction lay at the heart of his leadership. While he fought for a more just and equitable system, he was unable to avoid the trappings of power and the authoritarianism that inevitably accompanied it. His attempt to blend religious and political ideals created a further contradiction in his leadership. As a deeply devout Puritan, Cromwell believed that England's political structure should reflect the will of God. Yet his reforms, such as the ban on dancing, theater, and public festivities, were perceived by many as oppressive and alienating. The imposition of religious morality on a diverse population created widespread resentment, and many saw Cromwell's government as a form of religious tyranny rather than a force for liberation. The very people he sought to protect and uplift were often those who felt most persecuted under his rule. The burden of Cromwell's personal faith.
Cromwell's religious faith was perhaps the most defining feature of his character and his leadership. His unwavering belief that he was chosen by God to carry out a divine mission imbued his actions with a sense of moral certainty. Cromwell believed that his victories in battle and his rise to power were not the result of human effort alone, but were divinely ordained. He often referred to his leadership as a sacred duty, and he saw himself as an instrument of God's will. However, this deep religious conviction also made Cromwell vulnerable to inner turmoil and moral questioning. The ruthless military campaigns he waged, particularly in Ireland, were justified by him as necessary to establish a godly order, but they also caused immense suffering and left him with a legacy of violence that was difficult to reconcile with his faith. Cromwell's belief in a just and righteous cause was clouded by the brutal methods he employed to achieve it. The massacre at Drogheda, where thousands of Irish civilians and soldiers were killed, remains one of the most controversial aspects of his legacy. While Cromwell defended the massacre as a necessary military action to end the conflict, the moral cost of such actions was never far from his conscience. Cromwell's religious convictions also led him to impose a strict moral code on England, restricting activities he deemed sinful or immoral. His Puritan reforms, including the closing of theaters and the prohibition of Christmas celebrations, were an attempt to purify English society and bring it in line with his vision of a godly kingdom. However, these reforms were deeply unpopular and led to resentment among many segments of the population, who saw Cromwell as a tyrant rather than a liberator. The conflict between Cromwell's religious ideals and the realities of governance created an ongoing tension throughout his rule, making it impossible for him to find peace. Cromwell's legacy and the aftermath of his death. Cromwell's death did not bring the closure he might have hoped for, nor did it end the tumultuous debates about his rule and legacy. In the years following his death, England was plunged into a period of political instability. His son, Richard Cromwell, briefly took the title of Lord Protector, but lacked the political acumen and military support that his father had possessed. The result was a quick unraveling of the Commonwealth and the eventual restoration of the monarchy under Charles II. The restoration of the monarchy marked the end of the Republican experiment that Cromwell had fought so hard to establish, but it did not erase his influence. In fact, the events that followed Cromwell's death were heavily shaped by the divisions he had created within English society. The monarchy's return was not a simple return to the status quo. It was a deeply contested political moment, with royalists, republicans, and Puritans all vying for influence. Even after the monarchy was restored, the questions Cromwell had raised about the nature of power, the role of the monarchy, and the possibility of a republic continued to influence political discourse in England for generations. The posthumous treatment of Cromwell's body by the monarchy further symbolizes the deep divisions he had caused. In 1661, Cromwell's exhumed body was publicly hung and beheaded as part of an effort to erase his legacy. This symbolic act of vengeance was an attempt to completely repudiate Cromwell's challenge to the monarchy and to restore the idea that the monarchy was God's ordained form of governance. Yet despite this public desecration of his body, Cromwell's political ideals continued to influence later political developments. The Republican ideas he championed would resurface in the 1688 Glorious Revolution, which resulted in the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, a system that balanced the power of the monarchy with that of Parliament, a concept that Cromwell had fought for but could never fully achieve. Cromwell's restless legacy, a man who could never rest. In the end, Oliver Cromwell's life was one of restless striving, a man who sought to reform England and create a godly republic, yet found himself ensnared by the very forces of power and conflict he sought to control. His quest for peace, whether personal, political, or spiritual, was never realized. Cromwell sought to build a better society, but in doing so he had to wrestle with the contradictions of his actions. His religious convictions drove him to pursue righteousness, yet the means he used to achieve his ends often contradicted the very ideals he espoused. Cromwell's inability to rest, both in his personal life and in his political endeavors, serves as a cautionary tale about the cost of ambition. Leaders who seek to reshape the world often find that their actions come with unintended consequences, and the idealism that drives them can sometimes lead to tyranny. Cromwell's story is a reminder that even those who are driven by a deep sense of purpose and moral conviction can find themselves caught in a cycle of conflict, unable to escape the consequences of their decisions. As we reflect on Cromwell's legacy, we are reminded that the pursuit of greatness often comes at a high price, and the rest that one seeks in life can often remain out of reach. Cromwell's life, defined by his relentless ambition and his complex relationship to power, is a story of striving for ideals that were never fully realized, a testament to the cost of leadership and the paradox of power. His legacy, both a triumph and a tragedy, continues to reverberate through history, serving as a reminder that the pursuit of peace and rest is often fraught with complexity, contradiction, and unintended consequences.
As we explore the final layers of Oliver Cromwell's story, it becomes clear that his legacy cannot be fully understood without considering the deeper psychological and emotional forces that shaped his actions. His life was a complex interplay of personal convictions, political aspirations, and the challenges of governing a nation in the throes of revolutionary change. Cromwell's quest for rest was not just a desire for peace, but a reflection of his inner turmoil and the weight of his actions, which he could never fully reconcile with his sense of divine purpose. The psychological burden of power. The psychological toll of leadership was immense for Cromwell. He was thrust into power not by desire, but by necessity, and once he assumed control, the weight of his responsibility became a constant burden. As Lord Protector, Cromwell was not just a political leader, he was a symbolic figure representing the hopes and fears of the nation. His actions, from his military campaigns to his imposition of moral laws, were seen as divinely sanctioned by many of his followers. This sense of divine duty likely heightened his sense of responsibility, yet it also contributed to the immense pressure he faced. Cromwell's decision to execute King Charles I was perhaps the most defining moment of his career. He believed that it was a necessary act to cleanse England of its monarchy and establish a republic, but the psychological burden of that decision must have been enormous. The execution of a king was not just a political act, it was a spiritual act, one that shook the foundations of the political and religious order. For Cromwell, it was a moment of both triumph and tragedy, a victory over tyranny, but also a moment of moral ambiguity that would follow him throughout his life. Despite his religious justification, the bloodshed and the consequences of such an act must have weighed heavily on his conscience, especially as his own reign was marred by conflict and violence. The toll of Cromwell's military campaigns, particularly in Ireland, cannot be overstated. The conquest of Ireland and the massacres that accompanied it was a source of lasting shame for many who viewed Cromwell as a tyrant. While Cromwell justified the violence as necessary for securing the future of the Commonwealth, the atrocities committed during this campaign left a legacy of hatred and resentment that would endure for centuries. For Cromwell, who saw himself as an instrument of divine justice, the moral contradictions of his actions must have been deeply troubling. Despite his efforts to create a godly society rooted in Puritan values, his rule was tainted by the very violence he had used to enforce it. As his reign continued, Cromwell's internal struggles became more pronounced. Despite his political successes, he could not escape the fact that the republic he had fought for was marked by instability. The tensions between his religious convictions and the practical realities of leadership created a growing sense of inner conflict. Cromwell's desire to create a godly society rooted in Puritan values was constantly at odds with the political realities of governing a diverse and divided nation. The more he attempted to impose his ideals, the more resistance he encountered. This created a vicious cycle where his actions, though driven by a sincere belief in their righteousness, often led to more division and unrest. The illusion of rest, the inescapability of legacy. Cromwell's death did not bring him the rest he sought in life. His death, followed by the brief and unsuccessful rule of his son, Richard, paved the way to the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. The return of Charles II was a repudiation of Cromwell's Republican experiment, signaling the return of the monarchy and the end of the Commonwealth. For many, this was seen as a return to stability and tradition, but for others, it was a reminder of the failure of Cromwell's vision for England. The posthumous treatment of Cromwell's body in 1661, his exhumation, execution, and public display, was an attempt by the monarchy to completely erase his influence from the national consciousness. This symbolic act of vengeance served as a final rejection of Cromwell's challenge to the monarchy and his attempt to reshape the political order. The desecration of his body was meant to sever the connection between Cromwell and the Republican ideals he had fought for. Yet this act of finality did not extinguish Cromwell's influence. The very nature of his political experiment, his challenge to the monarchy, his belief in a godly republic, and his confrontation with the powers of the establishment remained a significant part of England's political history. In fact, the restoration of the monarchy did not mark the end of the Republican ideal. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, which saw the establishment of a constitutional monarchy under William and Mary, reflected the ideas and tensions that Cromwell had helped to raise during his own rule. While the monarchy had been restored, the political environment that Cromwell had helped to shape was altered irreversibly. The struggles he had initiated, even if unsuccessful in his time, set the stage for later constitutional reforms that limited royal power and established parliamentary sovereignty. Cromwell's restless legacy, a continuing debate. Cromwell's legacy remains one of the most debated and divisive in British history. On one hand, he is remembered as a hero who fought for liberty, justice, and a more democratic society. His actions in the English Civil War and the establishment of the Commonwealth were a bold challenge to the monarchy and the political establishment. Cromwell's leadership, though often authoritarian, was rooted in a belief in the power of the people and the need for a government that reflected divine will. He was a man who believed in the possibility of creating a more just and righteous society, even if the means to achieve it were deeply flawed. On the other hand, Cromwell's legacy is marred by the brutality of his military campaigns, the authoritarian nature of his rule, and the religious intolerance that marked his regime. His attempt to impose a godly order on a diverse nation led to widespread resistance and resentment. Cromwell's use of violence to achieve political ends has led many to view him as a tyrant rather than a liberator. His reliance on the military to maintain control and his suppression of political dissent are viewed by some as evidence of the dangers of concentrated power. Ultimately, Cromwell's legacy is defined by the paradoxes of his life. He was a man who sought to create a republic based on religious and political freedom, but found himself ensnared by the very forces he sought to control. His desire for rest, both personal and political, was never achieved, and his actions left a lasting imprint on the nation he sought to transform. The restless pursuit of greatness, while noble in its intentions, proved to be a source of inner conflict and external division. The eternal quest for rest, a lesson from Cromwell's life. Oliver Cromwell's life is a poignant reminder of the complexities of leadership and the human cost of political ambition. His search for rest, whether in the form of personal peace, political stability, or a more just society, was a goal that was forever out of reach. His legacy serves as a cautionary tale for those who seek to change the world. that the pursuit of ideals can often lead to unintended consequences, and the cost of leadership can be far greater than anticipated. Cromwell's story is also a reflection of the tension between ambition and morality, between the pursuit of power and the desire for peace. His internal struggle, as well as the external conflicts that defined his reign, highlight the difficulty of reconciling personal beliefs with the realities of governance. His life demonstrates that the quest for rest, whether for oneself or for a nation, can be elusive, especially when that quest is defined by the pursuit of transformative change. In the end, Cromwell's legacy remains restless, much like the man himself. His actions, both visionary and violent, left a profound mark on English history. His story is a reminder that rest is not always the reward for those who seek to reshape the world, and that the cost of leadership can be far greater than anticipated. Oliver Cromwell's restless legacy endures as both a triumph and a tragedy, a symbol of the complexities of power, faith, and leadership.
9. Oliver Cromwell's legacy is a story that continues to provoke discussion and reflection, illustrating the complexities of power, faith, and leadership. As we dig deeper into his life, we see how his pursuit of a republican England, grounded in his religious convictions, shaped his actions, but also led him to contradictions that were ultimately impossible to resolve. His quest for rest was not merely a longing for personal peace, but a desire for resolution in his leadership, his vision for England, and his inner spiritual conflicts. Yet even in death, the rest he sought remained unattainable. Cromwell's role in shaping modern Britain. While Cromwell's reign was marked by political instability and moral ambiguity, his impact on the future of Britain cannot be overstated. The very nature of his challenge to the monarchy, along with his establishment of the Commonwealth, shook the foundations of the English political system and laid the groundwork for the development of modern British democracy. At the time of Cromwell's rise to power, England had been ruled by monarchs for centuries. The idea of a republic, a government without a king, was radical, and Cromwell's pursuit of this ideal created one of the most significant political experiments in British history. Although the monarchy was restored just a few years after Cromwell's death, the ideas he championed regarding the supremacy of Parliament, the limits of royal power, and the importance of religious and civil liberty were not easily forgotten. Cromwell's time in power marked a shift in the political dynamics of England. While his rule was often seen as authoritarian, it set the stage for future constitutional developments. The debates surrounding the nature of government, the role of the monarchy, and the balance of power between Parliament and the Crown would continue to shape British politics, leading to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the eventual rise of constitutional monarchy, which we recognize in Britain today. Cromwell's leadership style, from reluctant ruler to authoritarian. Cromwell's leadership style was marked by a tension between his Puritan ideals and the reality of holding power. Though he saw himself as a man chosen by God to lead England to a new era, he was not entirely comfortable with the political and military authority he had gained. In the early stages of the Civil War, he was a fierce and determined commander, driven by a belief in divine providence. But as he rose to power, his leadership was increasingly defined by a sense of responsibility that led to internal conflict. Initially, Cromwell's rise was driven by his military prowess. He became known for his fierce leadership in battle, and his ability to inspire and motivate his troops was a key factor in the success of the new model army. However, as he consolidated power and assumed the role of Lord Protector, his leadership became more authoritarian. He relied heavily on the army to maintain control, bypassing or dissolving Parliament when it proved inconvenient. This reliance on military strength contrasted with the republican ideals he initially espoused, and it created a paradox in Cromwell's rule. Cromwell often justified his actions through religious conviction, claiming that his decisions were guided by God. Yet, as his reign progressed, it became increasingly clear that his pursuit of a godly republic was also a pursuit of political control.
His rule became synonymous with the imposition of puritanical values, from banning public amusements to imposing restrictions on religious practices. The tension between his religious ideals and his authoritarian approach to governance is one of the most defining aspects of his leadership. The paradox of Cromwell's legacy, a vision for freedom built on tyranny. The paradox at the heart of Cromwell's story is perhaps the most intriguing aspect of his tale. Cromwell was a man who sought to create a more just and godly society, but his methods often contradicted his ideals. In his attempts to rid England of what he saw as the corruption of monarchy and establish a republic based on religious freedom, he was forced to engage in political repression, military conquest, and the suppression of dissent. Cromwell's vision for a free republic was in many ways a utopian ideal. He believed that if England could be freed from the monarchy, it could establish a government that would be more just, more equitable, and more in line with God's will. However, his rule was marked by increasing authoritarianism. Cromwell's leadership was shaped by the idea that his actions were divinely sanctioned, and that the means justified the ends. He saw his military campaigns, his control of Parliament, and his imposition of moral laws as necessary steps in the creation of a new order. Yet the very authoritarianism that Cromwell employed to achieve this vision undermined the republican ideals he championed. This contradiction between the desire to create a free and just society and the use of tyrannical methods to achieve it is at the heart of Cromwell's legacy. He may have had noble intentions, but his actions were often at odds with the very ideals he sought to uphold. This contradiction ultimately tarnished his reputation, both in his lifetime and in the centuries that followed. Cromwell's final rest, a legacy that refused to die. Though Cromwell sought rest in both his personal life and in his political legacy, his efforts were never fully realized. His death in 1558 was followed by the brief and unsuccessful rule of his son, Richard Cromwell. This was quickly followed by the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II. The restoration of the monarchy was in many ways a rejection of Cromwell's vision for England. It symbolized the return to the traditional political order, and the Commonwealth he had fought for was dismantled. However, the monarchy's return did not mark the end of Cromwell's influence. In fact, the political environment created by Cromwell's Republican experiment continued to shape British politics long after his death. The political divisions he created, the debates he sparked about the nature of government, and the ideals he championed remained alive in the political discourse of the time. The symbolic act of desecrating Cromwell's body after his death, exhuming it, executing it posthumously, and displaying its head on a pike, was an attempt to erase his influence from history. Yet even in death, Cromwell's ideas persisted. His vision for a more balanced relationship between Parliament and the monarchy would come to fruition in later years, culminating in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which established the constitutional monarchy that we recognize in Britain today. In this sense, Cromwell's legacy was not a complete failure, but rather one of long-term influence. Cromwell's rest, the rest that never came. Ultimately, Oliver Cromwell's life was defined by his restless pursuit of political and spiritual ideals. He sought rest in the form of peace for England, stability for his government, and reconciliation with his faith. Yet despite his many accomplishments, he was never able to achieve these forms of rest. His internal struggles, political contradictions, and authoritarian rule prevented him from finding peace, and his legacy, both revered and reviled, continued to haunt England long after his death. Cromwell's story is a reminder of the complexities of leadership and the high price of transformative change. Those who seek to reshape the world often find that their actions create more conflict and division than resolution. Cromwell may have had noble intentions, but his actions were often at odds with the very ideals he sought to uphold. This contradiction ultimately tarnished his reputation, both in his lifetime and in the centuries that followed. In the end, the rest that Cromwell sought, whether personal peace, political stability, or spiritual resolution, remained out of reach. His life was a constant struggle to balance his religious convictions with the demands of leadership, and his legacy, though significant, was marked by the very contradictions he sought to overcome. Its life serves as both a cautionary tale and an enduring testament to the costs of ambition. The rest he sought may have been impossible to attain, but his influence on the political and religious landscape of England and on the world remains undeniable. His legacy lives on, not as a simple story of triumph or failure, but as a complex, multifaceted narrative of a man who sought to change the world, but was never able to find the rest he so desperately desired.
As we continue to unpack the complexities of Oliver Cromwell's life, it becomes clear that the man who sought to transform England was inextricably tied to the very forces of contradiction and paradox that shaped his leadership and legacy. His story is one that embodies both the ambition to reshape society and the profound personal costs of such transformation. The idea of rest, both personal and political, was central to Cromwell's life, but in the end remains an unattainable goal, one that speaks to the deeper themes of ambition, sacrifice, and the legacy of power. The Unfinished Revolution, Cromwell's unfulfilled vision of a republic. Cromwell's vision for England was revolutionary. As a leader of the parliamentary forces during the English Civil War, his commitment to overthrowing the monarchy and establishing a republic rooted in Puritan values was central to his political philosophy. His desire to dismantle the centuries-old system of monarchy and replace it with a government that was accountable to the people was groundbreaking. Cromwell was not only fighting a political battle against King Charles I, he was challenging the very structure of English governance itself. Yet even as he dismantled the monarchy, Cromwell's idea of a republic was far from the democratic ideals that we associate with modern republics. His idea of government was deeply shaped by his Puritan faith, and this meant that he believed political power should be guided by religious authority. Cromwell sought to create a godly society where the laws of God, as interpreted by the Puritans, would guide the actions of the government. In this vision, political freedom and religious freedom were deeply intertwined. Freedom for those who adhered to the Puritan faith, but not for those who did not. Cromwell's attempt to establish a republic was marked by his insistence on military control. The new model army, which had been instrumental in defeating the Royalists, became the backbone of his government. His reliance on military power and the army's support meant that although Cromwell claimed to be the leader of a republic, his rule was authoritarian in practice. Parliament was often sidelined or dissolved, and Cromwell assumed dictatorial powers as Lord Protector. His belief that he was carrying out God's will was central to his actions, but this belief also made it difficult for him to embrace the more flexible, democratic elements of republican governance. The failure of Cromwell's vision for a lasting republic can be seen in the rapid collapse of the Commonwealth after his death. Despite his significant role in creating the republic, Cromwell was never able to solidify it as a lasting political system. His son, Richard Cromwell, who briefly succeeded him, lacked the authority and military support to maintain the political order, and within 2 years the monarchy was restored under Charles II. This restoration marked the end of the Republican experiment, but it also underscored the inherent contradictions in Cromwell's vision, a vision that sought freedom and justice but was underpinned by authoritarian rule. Cromwell's struggle with his own legacy, the paradox of power. Cromwell's desire for a republic, free from monarchy, was deeply intertwined with his personal spiritual beliefs. He genuinely believed that England's salvation required the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a government aligned with God's will. In many ways, Cromwell saw himself as a divine instrument chosen to carry out a holy mission for the country. However, the moral and psychological toll of this self-assigned role was immense. One of the most striking aspects of Cromwell's life is the profound internal struggle that often characterized his actions.
As a devout Puritan, he was convinced that he was doing God's work, yet the bloodshed and political repression necessary to achieve his goals created a significant moral conflict. The violence of the Civil War and his brutal campaigns in Ireland, particularly the infamous massacre at Drogheda, left him with a legacy of violence that he could not easily reconcile with his spiritual beliefs. Throughout his rule, Cromwell grappled with the tension between his sense of divine mission and the brutal reality of the means he had to employ to maintain power. His use of military force to achieve political goals was a clear contradiction of his religious convictions. Cromwell may have seen himself as a divinely appointed leader, but the very violence he used to protect and enforce his republic must have caused immense inner conflict. His desire for a godly, peaceful society, free from the corruption of the monarchy, was at odds with the methods he used to attain it, creating a dissonance that marked his rule and continued to haunt his legacy. The restoration of the monarchy, the failure of Cromwell's political experiment. Cromwell's death did not bring the closure he might have hoped, and the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II in 1660 was a stark repudiation of his republican experiment. While Cromwell had sought to replace the monarchy with a government based on Puritan ideals, the Restoration symbolized the return to a system of governance that Cromwell had fought to dismantle. The monarchy's return was seen as a return to normalcy for many, but for others it was a reminder of the failure of Cromwell's vision for England. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 was a moment of political and ideological defeat for Cromwell's supporters. Despite the relatively brief nature of his rule, Cromwell's republican ideals had left a mark on English society. His political experiment had challenged the traditional structures of power, and even after the monarchy was restored, the questions he raised about governance and authority continued to influence political discourse. Yet despite this political setback, Cromwell's legacy could not be erased. The monarchy's return did not mean that the ideas Cromwell championed, the supremacy of Parliament, the limits of royal power, and the idea of a godly society were entirely forgotten. Cromwell's reign had planted the seeds for future political reform, and the political instability that followed the Restoration laid the groundwork for the eventual establishment of constitutional monarchy in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Cromwell's influence was felt not in the immediate aftermath of his death, but in the long-term trajectory of England's political development. Cromwell's posthumous legacy, from villain to hero. After his death, Cromwell's legacy remained divisive. During the Restoration, the monarchy sought to erase his influence through the symbolic act of exhuming his body, executing it posthumously, and displaying his head. This gruesome act, intended to sever the connection between Cromwell and the Republic, instead highlighted the enduring impact of his actions. It became a symbolic gesture of the monarchy's attempt to reclaim the nation and restore the traditional power structures. Yet Cromwell's legacy could not be so easily buried. Over time, his role in the English Revolution and the establishment of the Commonwealth came to be seen in a more positive light, especially as ideas of parliamentary sovereignty and republicanism gained traction. Cromwell's legacy was reinterpreted as that of a visionary leader who sought to create a government based on justice, religious freedom, and the rule of law. While his methods and the authoritarian nature of his rule were still critiqued, his commitment to reforming England's political system became more appreciated in the context of future democratic developments. However, it is important to recognize that Cromwell's legacy is still a deeply contested one. While he is seen as a hero by some, others continue to view him as a tyrant, particularly for his actions in Ireland and his authoritarian rule. The complexity of his character and the contradictions of his leadership make him a figure who will always provoke debate. The rest that was never attained. At the heart of Cromwell's life is a paradox. The man who sought to create a godly republic free from monarchy and tyranny could never find the rest he sought. His relentless pursuit of this ideal left him in a state of constant conflict, both internally and externally. He sought to bring peace and justice to England, but found himself caught in a cycle of violence and political turmoil. His legacy is one of ambition, sacrifice, and the high costs of leadership, a reminder that the pursuit of greatness often comes with a price that one may never be able to fully pay. Cromwell's quest for personal and political rest was unfulfilled, not because of a lack of effort, but because of the inherent contradictions in his leadership. He sought to create a republic based on religious freedom, yet he was unable to reconcile his authoritarian methods with the ideals of liberty he espoused. His story is one of the pursuit of transformative change, often coming at a high cost, and that the quest for peace and rest, whether personal or political, may always remain just out of reach. Oliver Cromwell's life and legacy remain a testament to the complexities of leadership, the challenges of reform, and the often paradoxical nature of history. His restless pursuit of a better society, though flawed, continues to shape the political discourse today, proving that the quest for rest, both for the leader and for the nation, is often a journey that never truly reaches its destination.
As we continue to explore Oliver Cromwell's life and legacy, it becomes clear that his story encapsulates a series of profound contradictions, not just in the political sphere, but within his own psyche. Cromwell was a man of intense religious conviction and ambition, someone who viewed himself as an instrument of divine providence. Yet, despite his convictions, his life was marked by political turbulence, moral ambiguity, and a relentless drive for power and reform. His legacy is an intricate web of ideals, failures, and profound consequences that have rippled through history. Cromwell's story is not one of clear-cut heroism or villainy, but a tale of a man caught between ideals and realities, between personal sacrifice and the cost of leadership. The continuing struggle between ideals and realities. One of the key themes that defines Cromwell's life is the tension between his ideals and the harsh realities he faced as a leader. His desire to create a godly republic was driven by his deeply held Puritan faith, but the means by which he sought to achieve that goal were often at odds with the very values he espoused. Cromwell's political career was a balancing act between his vision for a just and godly society and the need to maintain control over a nation that was divided and disillusioned. At the heart of this tension was Cromwell's insistence on using military force to maintain order. While he sought to build a government that reflected his religious ideals, he did so through the imposition of authoritarian rule, relying on the army and military intervention to quell opposition. His faith told him that his actions were divinely sanctioned, but the brutality of his military campaigns, particularly in Ireland, stands in stark contrast to the ideals of mercy and justice that he believed in. The massacre at Drogheda in 1649, where thousands of Irish civilians and soldiers were killed, is a defining moment in Cromwell's legacy, an act that many see as a betrayal of his own moral principles. Cromwell was also caught in a deep political paradox. While he sought to create a republic, he was unwilling to relinquish the centralized power that he believed was necessary to maintain stability. His relationship with Parliament was fraught with tension, as he often dissolved it when it opposed his policies. Cromwell's insistence on being both a leader and a reformer often led to decisions that were in direct conflict with his initial vision of a more democratic, inclusive republic. In seeking to create a new political system, he found himself relying on the very forms of power he had initially opposed: the monarchy's centralized control, military force, and religious authority. Cromwell's moral dilemmas and the burden of leadership. Cromwell's internal moral struggles were a defining aspect of his character and leadership. As a devout Puritan, he viewed his role as Lord Protector as a divine calling, yet the moral cost of his actions must have weighed heavily on him.
He consistently portrayed himself as an instrument of God's will, but the violence and authoritarianism necessary to achieve his political goals inevitably created a dissonance between his ideals and his actions. The more he sought to reshape England, the more he found himself trapped in a cycle of conflict, compromise, and sacrifice. In his pursuit of religious and political reform, Cromwell became embroiled in a series of moral compromises. The conquest of Ireland, which he justified as a necessary military campaign to secure the Commonwealth, resulted in a great deal of bloodshed and brutality. While he defended his actions as a means to end the conflict and impose order, the atrocities committed by his forces left a stain on his reputation that he could not wash away. In his later years, Cromwell must have faced profound moral confusion as his idealism collided with the harsh realities of his own rule. His belief in a godly society was at odds with the violence and coercion he employed to establish it, and this contradiction likely caused him deep inner turmoil. Cromwell's actions often betrayed the very values he held dear. While he sought to create a government rooted in religious freedom and justice, his policies restricted the very freedoms he had once championed. His imposition of Puritan values on the population through laws that banned public celebrations, closed theaters, and restricted religious practices made him increasingly unpopular, particularly among those who did not share his faith. His authoritarianism undermined his vision of a free republic, and it led to divisions within his own ranks, where factions within Parliament and the military began to question his leadership. The price of power, Cromwell's reluctance and desire for rest. Despite his deep sense of duty and divine calling, Cromwell was never fully comfortable with the power he wielded. In the early stages of the Civil War, he was a reluctant leader, a man who had risen to prominence not through personal ambition, but through circumstance and conviction. However, as he assumed more control, he realized that power, especially the power to shape a nation, came with a heavy price. Cromwell's personal struggle with power was evident in his reluctance to take on the role of Lord Protector. Though he accepted the title out of a sense of responsibility, he was never fully comfortable in it. His attempts to relinquish power, particularly after his death, were indicative of his inner conflict. Cromwell's desire for rest, both personal and political, became more pronounced in his later years. As his health declined, and as the political landscape became increasingly unstable, Cromwell may have yearned for peace, not just for England, but for himself. Yet the very nature of leadership meant that rest was unattainable. The weight of his leadership, coupled with the constant struggles between his ideals and the realities of his rule, left Cromwell in a state of constant tension. He could never fully reconcile his desire for peace with the political turmoil that surrounded him. Even in his final years, when he faced personal and political exhaustion, Cromwell found himself unable to relinquish the burden of leadership. In this sense, Cromwell's life was a testament to the unyielding demands of power and the impossibility of finding peace in a world shaped by conflict and ambition. Cromwell's posthumous rest, the enduring legacy of a restless leader. Cromwell's death in 1658 did not bring him the rest he sought, and the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 was a rejection of his republican experiment. Yet his death did not erase his influence. In fact, his legacy endured long after the monarchy's return, and his political ideals continued to influence debates about the role of the monarchy, the power of Parliament, and the relationship between church and state. The desecration of Cromwell's body in 1661 as an act of symbolic vengeance by the monarchy was meant to erase his legacy and restore the traditional order. Yet, despite this attempt to wipe away his influence, Cromwell's ideals continued to resonate in the political discourse of the time. His vision of a republic based on religious freedom, his belief in the sovereignty of Parliament, and his challenge to the monarchy became key touchstones for later political reforms.
The political upheaval caused by the English Civil War and Cromwell's reign set the stage for later revolutions, such as the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which saw the establishment of constitutional monarchy. Despite the monarchy's return, Cromwell's legacy lived on in the form of the constitutional developments that followed. His commitment to limiting royal power and his belief in the importance of parliamentary representation laid the groundwork for the political system that would eventually emerge in Britain. Though Cromwell's vision for a republic was ultimately unfulfilled, his ideals were not forgotten. They would shape the trajectory of British politics and inspire future generations to continue the struggle for greater democracy and equality. The enduring paradox of Cromwell's restless legacy. The paradox of Cromwell's life lies in the fact that he sought to bring peace and rest to both England and himself, but his actions led to more conflict and division. His restless pursuit of a godly republic was marred by violence, authoritarianism, and moral contradictions. Despite his sincere desire to create a better society, Cromwell's methods often undermined the very ideals he sought to uphold. His inability to find rest, both personally and politically, is a reflection of the complexities of leadership and the impossibility of achieving true peace in a world defined by ambition and conflict. Cromwell's life continues to stir debate and reflection, both as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and as a symbol of the ideals of liberty and republicanism. His restless legacy is one that will endure, provoking questions about the nature of power, governance, and the costs of idealism for generations to come.
As we continue to reflect on the life of Oliver Cromwell, it becomes increasingly evident that the complexities of his character, leadership, and legacy cannot be easily unraveled. His journey was defined not just by political ambition and military prowess, but by a profound spiritual conviction that drove him to act in ways that both shaped the course of English history and created tensions that ultimately thwarted his own personal quest for rest and peace. In many ways, Cromwell's legacy, marked by contradictions and unfulfilled desires, provides invaluable lessons for understanding the high costs of leadership, the limits of idealism, and the complex relationship between ambition and morality. The eternal struggle, Cromwell's faith and the politics of power. Cromwell's deep Puritan faith was not only a driving force in his personal life, but also in his public persona. From his early years, Cromwell saw himself as a man of destiny, chosen by God to fight against the corrupt monarchy and to build a society based on biblical principles. This sense of divine calling gave him a sense of purpose and legitimacy that fueled his resolve. However, his spiritual conviction also led to an internal conflict that defined his leadership. On one hand, Cromwell was uncompromising in his belief that he was carrying out God's will. His decisions, including the execution of King Charles I, his role in the military campaigns, and his policies for religious and moral reform, were all framed as part of a larger divine plan. Yet, on the other hand, Cromwell's devotion to religious purity often collided with the harsh realities of political leadership. His desire to create a godly society clashed with the authoritarian measures he had to implement to maintain control. The very values he held dear, justice, mercy, and righteousness, were sometimes sidelined in the pursuit of political power. The moral compromises Cromwell made during his time in power created a tension between his faith and his actions. The violence in Ireland, the persecution of religious minorities, and the suppression of political dissent were all carried out in the name of creating a better society. But these actions left Cromwell facing a spiritual dilemma. Could the ends justify the means? Was it possible to create a godly society through force and repression? The very act of pursuing divine justice through authoritarianism ultimately contradicted the core principles of the Christian faith that he sought to uphold. This internal struggle may have been one of the key reasons why Cromwell never found the rest he sought. Despite his intense religious devotion, the unyielding pressure of leadership, combined with the moral contradictions of his actions, kept him in a state of constant inner conflict. His inability to reconcile his faith with his political decisions undoubtedly contributed to the tension that defined his leadership. Cromwell and the paradox of liberty. Cromwell's vision for England was rooted in the idea of liberty, a liberty that would be guided by Christian values. He believed that the monarchy's corrupt influence needed to be removed in order to establish a system of governments that was both just and godly. However, the concept of liberty in Cromwell's vision was not the liberty of modern democratic thought, where individual rights and freedoms are paramount. Instead, it was the liberty to live in accordance with God's will, as interpreted by Puritans. For Cromwell, liberty was inseparable from religious adherence, and the liberty of those who did not share his beliefs was often restricted or suppressed. This paradox of liberty became one of the defining contradictions of Cromwell's reign. While he sought to free England from the tyranny of the monarchy, his methods of achieving that freedom were inherently authoritarian. The very republic he tried to establish was built on the idea that power should be in the hands of the people, yet he placed the military at the center of his rule. His reliance on the army to enforce his political vision meant that liberty was often limited to those who shared his views and religious practices. Furthermore, Cromwell's government was marked by a profound tension between his desire for religious freedom for Protestants and his intolerance for other religious groups, particularly Catholics and certain sects within Christianity. This created an atmosphere of repression and exclusion where liberty was not universally applied. His vision of freedom was shaped by his deeply held religious convictions, but it was a vision that was narrow and often at odds with the democratic and pluralistic ideals of liberty that would later define modern societies. Cromwell's inability to extend the very freedoms he sought to establish was another factor that led to his restless pursuit of peace. He desired to create a society where people could live freely according to their faith, but he could not reconcile this vision with the harsh, sometimes oppressive methods he had to use to enforce it. Cromwell's declining health, a reflection of political and personal exhaustion. As Cromwell's reign continued, it became clear that the toll of leadership was beginning to take its physical and emotional toll on him. His declining health in the final years of his life reflected not only the exhaustion that comes with holding absolute power, but also the personal strain of trying to reconcile his ambitions with the reality of his rule. Cromwell was not only battling political opposition, but also facing the mounting personal cost of his leadership. His health deteriorated as he dealt with the complexities of governing a divided nation and maintaining control over the military. The constant internal conflicts, the need to assert his authority, and the weight of the decisions he had made in the name of national and religious reform all contributed to his physical decline. It is said that Cromwell suffered from periodic bouts of illness, which may have been exacerbated by the immense stress of his position. The irony is that despite his political success and the victories he achieved, Cromwell was unable to rest. The very act of consolidating power and shaping the nation left him with little room for personal peace or respite. His desire for a godly society, free from the monarchy and based on his interpretation of religious justice, came at the expense of his health, happiness, and internal peace. His inability to rest, even in his final years, speaks to the toll that ambition and leadership can take on an individual. The Restoration and Cromwell's enduring influence. Despite Cromwell's death and the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, his influence did not fade. In fact, the very act of restoring the monarchy underscored the significance of Cromwell's reign and the republican ideals he had championed. The monarchy's return did not erase the ideas that Cromwell had put forward. It highlighted the unresolved political tensions that still existed in England. His experiment with republicanism and the political transformations he initiated forced England to grapple with the limitations of the monarchy and the role of Parliament in governing the country. Even in the aftermath of the monarchy's return, Cromwell's vision for a more balanced relationship between Parliament and the Crown lived on. His republican ideals and his belief in parliamentary sovereignty became foundational to the modern British constitutional system. Cromwell's posthumous legacy, therefore, is one of both failure and triumph. Though his dream of a permanent republic was short-lived, his ideas had a lasting impact on the development of English political thought. Cromwell's actions forced England to confront the tension between monarchy and parliamentary sovereignty, a tension that would continue to shape political life for centuries. The rest that was never found. In the end, Oliver Cromwell's life was defined by a ceaseless striving for power, for justice, for religious purity, and for political reform. His pursuit of these ideals came at a personal and political cost that he could never fully reconcile. Cromwell may have believed that his actions were divinely ordained, but the very nature of his leadership created contradictions and conflicts that he could never resolve. His desire for rest, whether in the form of personal peace, political stability, or spiritual reconciliation, remained elusive. Cromwell's story serves as a poignant reminder of the complexities of leadership. While his ambition to change the world was admirable, it also led him down a path of conflict, compromise, and eventual exhaustion. His life is a study in the moral and personal costs of political power, showing that the pursuit of greatness often requires sacrifices that are difficult to live with and sometimes impossible to undo. In the end, the rest that Cromwell sought was never fully attained. His legacy, though significant, remains a mixture of triumph and tragedy. It is a legacy of restless ambition, moral contradiction, and the enduring struggle to reconcile ideals with the demands of power. Cromwell's life stands as a cautionary tale about the cost of leadership and the elusive nature of true peace, a peace that for him remained forever out of reach.
As we delve even further into the story of Oliver Cromwell, it becomes clear that his life embodies not only the complexity of political leadership, but also the psychological and philosophical toll that such a life demands. The restless pursuit of his ideals, despite his accomplishments, sheds light on the darker side of ambition, the contradictions inherent in wielding power, and the tragic human cost of leadership. Cromwell's life and legacy offer timeless lessons about the intersection of morality, governance, and the personal costs of transformative political action. Cromwell's military leadership, a double-edged sword. Cromwell's military prowess was one of the defining elements of his rise to power. His leadership during the English Civil War, particularly his role in the new model army, was instrumental in securing victory for the parliamentary forces. He became a national hero to the Republicans and a symbol of the rise of a new order, where the monarch's absolute power was challenged and ultimately dethroned. Cromwell's strategic brilliance on the battlefield allowed him to lead England's armies with unmatched skill, gaining the respect of both his allies and enemies. However, his military career also highlights one of the paradoxes of his leadership. The very military victories that gave him the power to reshape England were also the same victories that created a regime dependent on force, undermining the republic he sought to establish. The new model army, while initially formed to defend parliamentary interests, came to represent Cromwell's personal power and ultimately his authoritarian rule. The army was the mechanism through which he imposed his will, both in military conquests and in internal political struggles. The conquest of Ireland remains the most controversial chapter of Cromwell's military career.
The brutal suppression of Irish forces, particularly during the sieges of Drogheda and Wexford, has stained his reputation and cast a long shadow over his legacy. Cromwell's justifications for these actions, his belief that they were necessary to quell rebellion and protect England's new government, do not mitigate the profound human suffering caused by the campaigns. His use of military force in Ireland is often cited as an example of his authoritarianism, and it stands as a clear contradiction to his stated mission of creating a just and godly society. For Cromwell, the army was an instrument of divine will, but the moral cost of using force to maintain power and enforce ideological conformity was significant. The paradox of a leader who sought to build a free and righteous society, yet relied on military repression to achieve it, continues to complicate the perception of his character. His military success was crucial in establishing the Commonwealth, but the long-term consequences of this reliance on force ultimately undermined the very principles he claimed to champion. The psychological cost of power, the burden of leadership. While Cromwell's military successes and political leadership may have been lauded by his supporters, the psychological toll of maintaining power and navigating the complexities of leadership was profound. His inner conflict, driven by his religious faith and his political ambitions, likely contributed to the sense of personal exhaustion that marked his later years. Cromwell's belief that he was carrying out God's will gave him a sense of purpose, but it also placed an enormous burden on him. The constant tension between his idealistic vision and the brutal realities of rule created an internal struggle that, combined with the political pressures of maintaining a republic, wore him down emotionally and physically. Cromwell's decline in health in his final years, his suffering from fevers, possibly exacerbated by the immense strain of leadership, suggests that the burden of his decisions and the weight of the political, military, and personal conflicts he faced may have been too much to bear. His physical decline rapidly intensified as his responsibilities intensified, and it seems likely that his physical decline was also tied to the toll that the moral and ethical contradictions of his rule took on him. Cromwell's desire to be seen as a man of faith and integrity, while simultaneously making difficult decisions that often contradicted those values, would have created a profound sense of disillusionment. Cromwell's inability to rest, both physically and spiritually, was perhaps his greatest personal tragedy. The sense of divine purpose that had propelled him forward now seemed to weigh on him as he struggled with the consequences of his actions. His reputation for spiritual and political righteousness stood in card-sharp contrast to the reality of his increasingly authoritarian rule. This dissonance between the leader he envisioned himself to be and the leader he had become likely contributed to his internal restlessness and his inability to achieve the peace he sought. The monarchy's return, the last rejection of Cromwell's vision. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660, which saw Charles II return to the throne, was a repudiation of everything Cromwell had fought for. The return to royal rule after Cromwell's death marked the collapse of the Republican experiment and the disintegration of the political order Cromwell had tried to establish. For many, the restoration of the monarchy was a return to normalcy, a return to the traditional order after the chaos of the English Civil War and the Commonwealth. However, Cromwell's ideas were not easily erased. While his Republican experiment may have failed, the questions he raised about the role of monarchy, the power of Parliament, and the rights of citizens continued to resonate within English political discourse. The very restoration of the monarchy highlighted the extent to which Cromwell's challenge to the status quo had impacted the political landscape. The monarchy's return did not simply erase Cromwell's Republican ideals, it brought them into sharper focus as a central point of political debate. The restoration also had a personal aspect for Cromwell. His posthumous execution, the act of exhuming his body and displaying it in public, was an attempt by the monarchy to erase his influence entirely.
This gruesome public act symbolized the monarchy's desire to wipe away the legacy of the man who had challenged royal power so fundamentally. Yet, despite this attempt to bury his legacy, Cromwell's political actions, his efforts to dismantle the monarchy, his military and political reforms, and his belief in a more representative form of government left an enduring impact on English politics. His vision of a republic and the lessons learned from his reign would shape political thought for centuries to come. Cromwell's rest, the elusive goal. Ultimately, Cromwell's life was characterized by a relentless striving to create a republic, to be a man of faith, to protect England from monarchy, and to bring peace to a divided nation. Yet, despite his many accomplishments, he was unable to achieve the rest he sought. His vision of a godly republic was never fully realized, his personal peace was never attained, and the contradictions within his own soul, between his ideals and his actions, prevented him from finding rest. Cromwell's pursuit of rest, whether it was political stability for England or spiritual peace for himself, highlights the deeply human side of his character. His internal struggles, moral contradictions, and the sacrifices he made in the name of political ambition are what ultimately define his legacy. Despite his role as a transformative figure in English history, Cromwell's inability to find rest reflects the complexities and burdens of leadership. The final irony of Cromwell's life is that the very revolution he sought to create, which was meant to bring peace and justice to England, ended in failure. The monarchy was restored, his republican ideals were undermined, and his posthumous desecration symbolized the rejection of his legacy. Yet Cromwell's influence continued to shape English politics, and his vision of a more balanced relationship between monarchy and parliament laid the groundwork for later democratic reforms. Cromwell's enduring legacy is the complexities of power and leadership. The enduring legacy of Oliver Cromwell is one of paradoxes. His ambition, his desire for a godly society, and his actions to shape the political future of England are both remarkable and deeply flawed. He was a man of profound conviction who sought to change the world, but the cost of that change, both personal and political, was immense. Cromwell's story illustrates the complexities of leadership, the tension between ideals and reality, the moral compromises leaders must make, and the burden of power. His relentless pursuit of a better society ultimately led him to a place of restlessness where peace was perpetually out of reach. In the end, Cromwell's legacy is not of simple triumph or failure, but a reminder that the pursuit of greatness, especially in the realm of politics, is fraught with contradictions, ethical dilemmas, and unforeseen consequences. His life serves as a powerful testament to the complexities of governance, the cost of ambition, and the human need for rest, a rest that for Cromwell was never fully realized.
As we continue to reflect on Oliver Cromwell's life and legacy, it becomes evident that his journey is not only a study in political power, but also a deeply personal and psychological struggle. The enduring complexity of his character, his motivations, and the consequences of his actions continue to inspire debate, not only because of his role in shaping England, but also because of the broader lessons his life imparts about the nature of power, leadership, and the human pursuit of ideals. The cost of Cromwell's reforms, ideals versus practical realities. Cromwell's ambition to reshape England was rooted in a deeply personal belief in the righteousness of his cause. His faith, bolstered by a sense of divine calling, drove him to challenge the centuries-old institution of the monarchy. The execution of King Charles I in 1649 was not merely an act of political rebellion, it was an act of religious fervor, a symbolic gesture that Cromwell believed was required to bring England into a new era of governance. However, the implementation of Cromwell's vision, while grounded in noble ideals, came at a significant cost, both to himself and to the nation. The problem with Cromwell's reforms was not the ideals themselves, freedom from tyranny, a more just society, and a government accountable to the people, but rather the practical realities of imposing those ideals on a deeply divided and complex society. Cromwell's insistence on imposing Puritan religious principles through legislation created friction with the diverse population of England. His attempts to regulate moral behavior, from the closing of theaters to restrictions on public holidays like Christmas, alienated large segments of the population who did not share his religious convictions. This authoritarian approach, often justified by Cromwell as necessary to build a godly society, became one of the most enduring criticisms of his rule. Cromwell's commitment to maintaining order through military strength also contributed to the contradictions in his political vision. While he believed in the need for a republic, his reliance on the army as the enforcer of his policies and the protector of his regime meant that his government became, in practice, increasingly authoritarian. Though he initially fought to remove the monarchy, his political rule relied heavily on military intervention, and this paradox is one of the central contradictions of his leadership. By seeking to establish a republic that would free England from the tyranny of the monarchy, Cromwell inadvertently created a system that was, in many ways, just as centralized and authoritarian as the monarchy he had overthrown. The paradox of Cromwell's reforms underscores the difficulty of balancing ideals with practical governance. His vision was one of a society ruled by divine justice, but the tools he employed to implement this vision, military force, religious censorship, and the suppression of dissent, ran counter to the ideals of freedom and liberty that he sought to establish. Cromwell's inability to reconcile his high ideals with the methods required to achieve them left him with an enduring moral ambiguity, one that would continue to be scrutinized long after his death. Cromwell's relationship with Parliament, the tension between authority and representation. Another significant aspect of Cromwell's leadership was his relationship with Parliament. Initially, Cromwell saw Parliament as a necessary institution for the representation of the people. However, as he gained power, his view of Parliament began to shift. His dissatisfaction with Parliament's inability to act in alignment with his vision led him to dissolve it more than once. Cromwell's desire to have complete control over the direction of the Commonwealth, even when Parliament was unwilling to follow, speaks to the centralization of power that defined his rule. Cromwell's relationship with Parliament was complex. At times, he worked to reform it, pushing for greater accountability and a more godly form of governance, but he was also willing to dissolve it entirely when it defied his authority. His belief in his divine right to lead made him suspicious of any opposition to his vision, and his determination to shape England's future meant that he would often act without consulting Parliament, or in some cases dismiss it altogether. This reliance on military power to ensure his authority over Parliament eventually led to an authoritarian system that was at odds with the democratic ideals he had initially supported. The paradox of Cromwell's reforms underscores the difficulty of balancing ideals with practical governance. His vision was one of a society ruled by divine justice, but the tools he employed to implement this vision, military force, religious censorship, and the suppression of dissent, ran counter to the ideals of freedom and liberty that he sought to establish. Cromwell's inability to reconcile his high ideals with the methods required to achieve them left him with an enduring moral ambiguity, one that would continue to be scrutinized long after his death. Cromwell's religious vision was another central aspect of his life and rule. His commitment to Puritanism, combined with his belief in his divine mission, shaped his policies and his understanding of what England should become. Cromwell envisioned a society where the state was aligned with religious values, and he was willing to impose these values on the population to create a godly nation. While Cromwell's religious ideals were based on a vision of a just and righteous society, his methods of imposing religious orthodoxy were far from inclusive. His Puritan reforms led to the suppression of religious diversity, particularly against Catholics, Anglicans, and other non-Puritan sects. Though he promoted freedom of conscience for Puritans, he denied the same freedom to those whose religious beliefs did not align with his own. Cromwell's religious intolerance created a political environment that was often oppressive, despite the fact that his overarching goal was to establish a just, godly society. The paradox of Cromwell's religious vision, seeking to create a free and just society while simultaneously suppressing religious diversity, became another key contradiction of his leadership. Though he saw his actions as necessary to fulfill God's will, the religious uniformity he sought often led to conflict and division within his own country. Cromwell's desire to impose a singular religious identity on England left little room for the tolerance and diversity that would later become fundamental principles of modern liberal democracies. Cromwell's legacy, the unfinished revolution. The legacy of Oliver Cromwell remains one of the most debated and complex in British history. His efforts to overthrow the monarchy, establish a republic, and create a godly society were groundbreaking, yet the methods he used to achieve these aims raised profound ethical questions. Cromwell's reliance on military force, religious intolerance, and authoritarianism contradicted the very ideals he sought to establish, leaving a legacy that is both heroic and tragic. In many ways, Cromwell's revolution was unfinished. The monarchy's restoration in 1660 marked the failure of the Republican experiment, but it also underscored the broader changes that Cromwell's rule had set in motion. Cromwell's challenge to the monarchy and the political system sparked a national debate that continued to reverberate through British history, influencing the eventual establishment of constitutional monarchy in the late 17th century. Though the Commonwealth lasted a short time, Cromwell's political and religious ideals laid the groundwork for future political reforms in Britain. Cromwell's posthumous legacy was also marked by an attempt to erase his influence. The execution of his body and the public display of his head were attempts to completely sever the connection between Cromwell and the Republican ideals he had championed. Yet, even in the face of this symbolic rejection, Cromwell's ideas continued to shape the political discourse in England, and his challenge to the monarchy remained a foundational moment in British history. The rest that was never found. Cromwell's lasting struggle. The ultimate tragedy of Cromwell's life is that he never found the rest he sought. His political ambition, religious convictions, and personal sacrifices all came at a heavy price. Though he sought to create a godly republic, his methods of achieving this vision, military force, religious suppression, and authoritarian rule, prevented him from attaining the peace and stability he desired for England and himself. Cromwell's inner turmoil, as he reconciled his personal beliefs with the political reality of his rule, is what defines his legacy as one of restless striving, not restful fulfillment. In death, as in life, Cromwell's rest was elusive. His posthumous execution and the monarchy's return were attempts to erase his legacy, but his influence endured, leaving a complicated and lasting imprint on England's political system. Cromwell's story continues to serve as a reminder that the pursuit of ideals, no matter how noble, often comes with unintended consequences. His inability to reconcile the ideals he espoused with the methods he employed highlights the complexity of leadership, the moral costs of ambition, and the human desire for peace that often remains out of reach. Ultimately, Oliver Cromwell's life teaches us that the pursuit of greatness, while noble in its intentions, often carries a heavy burden. It is a legacy that is both heroic and tragic, marked by contradictions that continue to resonate through history. Cromwell sought to change the world, but in doing so he paid a personal price, a price that ultimately prevented him from finding the rest he sought. His story is one of ambition, sacrifice, and the high cost of leadership, and it remains an enduring symbol of the paradoxes inherent in the pursuit of power and reform.
As we continue to explore the deeper layers of Oliver Cromwell's life and legacy, we uncover more about his profound psychological conflicts, his unwavering sense of divine purpose, and the far-reaching consequences of his actions on the trajectory of English and even global history.
His relentless drive to bring about a new order in England, an order that he believed was divinely ordained, resulted in a complex legacy that continues to spark debate to this day. The contradictions in his life offer important insights into the nature of power, leadership, and the burdens of ambition. The complexity of Cromwell's character, the man behind the mask. Oliver Cromwell's character was a unique blend of devotion, ambition, religious fervor, and pragmatism. He was deeply committed to his Puritan beliefs and believed that his rise to power was not just a personal achievement, but part of a divine plan. However, the very nature of Cromwell's faith created a tension within him that influenced his approach to leadership. His profound sense of duty to God and his nation often led him to make decisions that contradicted his own sense of morality. One of the most striking aspects of Cromwell's character was his belief that he was God's chosen instrument to fulfill a divine mission. Cromwell saw his actions not just as political, but as part of a larger divine struggle between good and evil. This spiritual conviction gave him a sense of confidence and purpose, but it also created a sense of moral absolutism, which often justified the more authoritarian and violent aspects of his leadership. He believed that he was building a godly society, but the methods he employed, such as military conquest and religious repression, often ran counter to the very ideals of justice and mercy that his faith espoused. Cromwell's psychological struggle is evident in the way he balanced his public persona as a military leader and politician with his private spiritual beliefs. While he was revered as a hero by many of his supporters, his internal conflict between religious idealism and the reality of political leadership was a constant tension. In his later years, it seems that this internal battle, coupled with the growing pressures of ruling a divided nation, took a significant toll on him both physically and emotionally. His deteriorating health in the years before his death suggests that despite his outward strength, he was inwardly struggling with the enormity of his decisions and their consequences. Cromwell's struggle with morality and leadership, the price of idealism. Cromwell's leadership was grounded in the desire to create a more just and godly society. He envisioned a world in which the government was not only accountable to the people, but also aligned with the will of God. Yet this idealistic vision was difficult to implement in practice. The very nature of leadership required compromises that contradicted his values. Cromwell's leadership, though rooted in noble ideals, was marked by a pragmatic willingness to impose his will through military force and political coercion. The paradox at the heart of Cromwell's leadership was his pursuit of a moral society through authoritarian means. He sought to impose Puritan values on the nation, believing that this was necessary for England's salvation. However, his attempts to create a morally just society were undermined by the violent means he used to enforce these values. The massacres in Ireland, particularly at Drogheda, and the suppression of political and religious dissent are prime examples of the moral contradictions that defined Cromwell's reign. In his pursuit of a better society, Cromwell often resorted to methods that were far from just or merciful. This moral struggle, the tension between his ideals of justice and the reality of governing, was compounded by his belief that he was carrying out a divine mission. Cromwell's sense of divine calling gave him a certainty of purpose, but it also led him to justify actions that, from a moral standpoint, were deeply problematic. The executions, military campaigns, and suppression of dissent were framed as necessary sacrifices for the greater good, yet they ultimately contradicted the very Christian values that Cromwell sought to uphold. Cromwell and the paradox of liberty, the limits of freedom. At the heart of Cromwell's political vision was the concept of liberty, yet his understanding of liberty was shaped by his Puritan beliefs. Cromwell sought to free England from the tyranny of the monarchy, But the liberty he envisioned was not one of personal freedom for all citizens. It was the liberty to live according to his interpretation of God's will. While Cromwell sought to rid England of the monarchy's absolutist rule, he also sought to establish a government that would be guided by his own religious and political values, limiting the freedom of those who did not share his beliefs. The paradox of Cromwell's vision of liberty is evident in his policies, which often contradicted the very principles of freedom that he claimed to champion. Though he fought to end the tyranny of the monarchy, Cromwell's regime became increasingly authoritarian, particularly in the way he imposed Puritan religious values on the population. The bans on theater, the suppression of religious dissent, and the restrictions on public celebrations were seen by many as violations of personal freedom. Cromwell, in his efforts to create a godly society, failed to recognize that true liberty includes the freedom to disagree, to practice different religions, and to live outside the constraints of a narrow moral vision. Cromwell's commitment to religious and political freedom was also selective. He was willing to extend religious toleration to certain Protestant sects, but he was harshly intolerant of Catholics, Anglicans, and other religious minorities. The limited nature of Cromwell's vision of liberty, which excluded those who did not adhere to his interpretation of the Bible, highlights the tension between his ideals of freedom and the authoritarian methods he employed to secure them. The Restoration and Cromwell's legacy. The enduring debate. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 represented the final repudiation of Cromwell's vision for England. His death, followed by the short-lived rule of his son Richard Cromwell, paved the way for the return of Charles II to the throne. The monarchy's return was seen by many as a return to stability after the chaos of the English Civil War and the Commonwealth, but it was also a reminder of the fragility of Cromwell's Republican experiment. Yet, despite the restoration, Cromwell's legacy lived on. The very act of restoring the monarchy was a direct response to the political turbulence created by Cromwell's challenge to royal authority. While the monarchy's return signified the failure of Cromwell's Republican vision, it also underscored the deep changes he had set in motion. The debates he sparked about the role of the monarchy, the power of Parliament, and the rights of citizens did not end with the Restoration. Rather, they laid the groundwork for future political developments, including the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which saw the establishment of a constitutional monarchy. Cromwell's political ideals, the need for a more accountable government, the balance of power between the monarchy and Parliament, and the protection of individual rights continued to resonate long after his death. Even the monarchy, though restored, would never return to the absolute power it once held. The very act of restoring the monarchy was an acknowledgement of the political changes Cromwell had initiated, even if they had not come to fruition in his lifetime. Cromwell's restless legacy, the irony of leadership. The ultimate tragedy of Cromwell's life is that despite many of his accomplishments, he never found the rest he sought. The rest he envisioned for England, a peaceful, godly republic free from monarchy, was never fully realized, and the peace he sought for himself remained elusive. His life was marked by a constant striving for moral, political, and spiritual fulfillment, but each victory was tempered by the contradictions and moral compromises that accompanied them. Cromwell's relentless pursuit of greatness, even in the name of justice and divine duty, kept him in a state of unceasing conflict. His desire to create a just society and his efforts to free England from the tyranny of the monarchy were commendable, but the means by which he sought to achieve these goals, violence, military control, and religious suppression, led to a legacy of division and unrest. His inability to reconcile the ideals he championed with the actions he took ensured that rest, both personal and political, remained beyond his grasp. the paradox of Cromwell's life, his desire for a republic rooted in justice and freedom, yet his reliance on authoritarian methods, serves as a powerful reminder of the complexities of leadership. His legacy is a story of ambition, sacrifice, and the unyielding tension between ideals and reality.
As we continue to reflect on Oliver Cromwell's life and legacy, the deeper we delve into his character, motivations, and the eventual outcomes of his actions, the more we begin to appreciate the complexity of his journey. Cromwell was not merely a figure of political intrigue or military command, but a man whose personal struggles, contradictions, and inability to find rest shed light on broader themes that resonate throughout history. The tension between ambition and morality, the limits of power, and the unintended consequences of transformative leadership. The emotional and psychological toll of Cromwell's leadership. At the heart of Cromwell's leadership was a profound sense of duty and responsibility, but also a constant emotional and psychological burden. While he was driven by an unwavering sense of divine purpose, his actions came with tremendous personal sacrifice. Cromwell's sense of moral righteousness, combined with the unyielding pressure of political leadership, led him into a state of constant internal conflict. Cromwell believed that his rise to power was part of a divine plan, and he viewed himself as God's instrument to cleanse England of its corrupt monarchy and to establish a godly republic. Yet the weight of this belief came with an immense psychological cost. The deeper Cromwell became enmeshed in his role as Lord Protector, the more he was confronted with the challenges of ruling in a divided nation. His conviction that he was fulfilling God's will likely helped him maintain the strength to lead, but it also isolated him from others who may have viewed his actions more critically. As the years wore on, Cromwell's emotional and psychological state deteriorated, reflecting the toll that his leadership took. His inner conflicts between religious idealism and the brutal measures he had to employ to maintain power left him with a sense of unrest. While his outward confidence was displayed in his leadership, a part of him must have questioned the methods he employed, particularly as his reign became increasingly autocratic. Cromwell's declining health towards the end of his life was not just the physical consequence of years of stress and exhaustion, but a manifestation of the spiritual and emotional strain of attempting to reconcile his actions with his ideals. The very nature of the reforms he pursued, militarily, politically, and socially, placed him in an impossible position, where the pursuit of a godly society demanded difficult sacrifices, both from himself and the nation. Cromwell may have seen himself as the chosen one to bring about change, but that very sense of divine responsibility likely left him questioning whether peace, both internally and externally, was ever achievable. Cromwell's struggle with the idea of legacy, a leader defined by his actions. One of the most profound ironies of Cromwell's life is that despite his numerous political and military successes, he failed to achieve the type of enduring legacy that many leaders seek. He envisioned himself as the father of a new, godly republic, one that would transform England for the better. Yet after his death, the very republic he had fought for was dismantled, and the monarchy was restored, effectively undoing the political changes he had spent so many years working towards. This failure to secure his vision in the long run highlights the fragility of political movements and revolutions. Despite Cromwell's conviction that he was laying the groundwork for a new England, the country quickly returned to the old order after his death. The restoration of the monarchy was both a political and symbolic rejection of the changes Cromwell had made. However, this very rejection speaks to the strength and impact of his ideas. Although the monarchy returned, the debates about power, liberty, and the role of Parliament that Cromwell had instigated persisted in British political thought, contributing to the eventual development of constitutional monarchy.
For Cromwell, the lack of permanent success could have been seen as a failure, and yet his legacy endures as a lesson about the complexities of political transformation. His revolutionary vision for England, while short-lived, laid the foundation for future political discourse. The impact of his leadership is seen not only in the changes he wrought in his time, but in the continuing debate over his methods and the long-term consequences of his leadership. Cromwell's tyranny, a necessary evil. A key element of the debate surrounding Cromwell's legacy is his authoritarian rule. Though he sought to establish a republic, his methods were increasingly autocratic. Cromwell's reliance on the army to maintain control both over Parliament and the populace was a key feature of his regime. His belief that only a strong, centralized leadership could maintain stability during a time of division led him to take increasingly dictatorial actions. His dissolution of Parliament, his reliance on military tribunals, and his imposition of strict moral laws were all part of his vision for a more godly society. However, these measures made him appear more like a tyrant than a liberator, contradicting the very principles of republicanism he sought to establish. The question arises, were Cromwell's actions a necessary evil? Was it inevitable that he would resort to authoritarian methods to preserve the political order he believed in? Cromwell's vision for England was one of righteousness, but his inability to achieve that vision without resorting to force reflects the inherent tensions in leadership during times of upheaval. His use of military power may have been seen by some as a necessary step in ensuring the survival of the Commonwealth, but it also undermined the democratic ideals that he claimed to uphold. This conflict between his moral convictions and the political realities of his rule created a legacy of tyranny that lingers as one of the most contentious aspects of his reign. Cromwell's legacy and its reflection on the limits of power. As we reflect on the broader implications of Cromwell's life, his legacy raises essential questions about the limits of political power. His ambition to reshape England, whether through military conquest, religious reforms, or political restructuring, was a monumental undertaking. Yet the very tools he used to achieve his goals were the same ones that eventually undermined his vision for a more just society. The use of force, the suppression of dissent, and the centralization of power made Cromwell's leadership ultimately paradoxical. A revolutionary leader who embraced the very forms of control and authority that he had initially opposed. This paradox of power highlights one of the central lessons of Cromwell's life, that the pursuit of a just and righteous society often requires moral compromises that may undermine the very principles being fought for. Cromwell believed that he could build a godly republic, but his actions, dictated by the political realities of his time, led him to adopt authoritarian tactics. The tension between his ideals of liberty and the methods he used to achieve them is a reminder of the limits of power, particularly when power is wielded by those who claim divine sanction. Cromwell's legacy is a warning about the danger of conflating power with moral righteousness. Even those who believe they are acting in the name of justice and truth can end up perpetuating systems of oppression, either intentionally or unintentionally. The story of Cromwell underscores the delicate balance between the pursuit of ideals and the reality of governing, and how the means of achieving noble ends can become just as important as the ends themselves. Cromwell's restless legacy, a model for reflection on leadership. In the end, Oliver Cromwell's legacy serves as a powerful reflection on the nature of leadership, ambition, and the human cost of political transformation. His life illustrates that those who seek to change the course of history are often faced with contradictions and dilemmas that challenge both their personal convictions and their methods. Cromwell's restless pursuit of a godly republic, a republic that he believed was divinely ordained, was marked by an internal struggle between his ideals and the actions required to achieve them. Though Cromwell sought to create a just and moral society, he was ultimately unable to find rest, either politically or personally. His vision for England, though revolutionary, was ultimately unfulfilled as the monarchy returned and his republic was dismantled. His legacy, both admired and reviled, is a testament to the complexities of leadership and the profound costs of political transformation. Cromwell's life and legacy invite us to consider the enduring questions about the nature of power, the responsibility of leaders, and the true cost of transformative change. Cromwell's restless pursuit of justice, despite the contradictions and moral compromises, remains a powerful lesson in the limitations of power and the human pursuit of ideals. The cost of leadership, as illustrated by Cromwell's story, is often far greater than one can anticipate, and the consequences of one's actions can be far-reaching long after their death. Cromwell's legacy continues to provoke reflection on these fundamental themes, ensuring that his story remains relevant as we delve even further into the lasting legacy of Oliver Cromwell, we begin to see how his life and actions serve as a reflection of the deeply human struggle between power, ideology, and the burden of leadership. Cromwell's trajectory, from an instrumental figure in the overthrow of the monarchy to a ruler who sought to reshape England into a godly republic, is a story riddled with contradictions and paradoxes that continue to resonate centuries after his death. His restless pursuit of justice and political transformation left an indelible mark on history, one that forces us to consider the interplay between personal ambition, public responsibility, and the moral compromises leaders often must make. Cromwell's role in the English Revolution, a man of the people or a tyrant. Cromwell's central role in the English Civil War, which resulted in the execution of King Charles I and the eventual establishment of the Commonwealth, was seen by many as the dawn of a new political order. As a member of Parliament and a leader of the new model army, Cromwell positioned himself as both a champion of liberty and a defender of the people's right to self-governance. He presented himself as a reformer, someone who wanted to break the chains of monarchic absolutism and create a society more in tune with Puritan values. However, Cromwell's rise to power was not without controversy. His leadership, especially in military campaigns, such as the conquest of Ireland, became the hallmark of an increasingly authoritarian regime. His decision to dismiss Parliament when it failed to align with his vision, the military tribunals that enforced his policies, and the widespread religious suppression were clear signs that his republic, which was meant to be a beacon of liberty, was becoming more and more like the very monarchy he had overthrown. This duality, Cromwell as both the hero of the common people and a military dictator, has been one of the most enduring sources of debate about his legacy. To some, he was a liberator, taking down the corrupt monarchy and establishing a government based on a new set of values. To others, he was a tyrant, consolidating power in his own hands and imposing his religious vision on a diverse nation. The question of whether Cromwell's leadership was justified by the ends he sought, or whether the means he employed ultimately betrayed the republican ideals he purported to champion, remains central to his legacy. The dangers of ideological purity, Cromwell's religious intolerance. A central component of Cromwell's vision for England was his desire to establish a society that was fundamentally godly, one that would be shaped by Puritan values. He saw himself as the instrument through which divine will could be executed, and in many ways his reforms were designed to create a society where the government was aligned with religious righteousness. Yet the religious intolerance that accompanied his vision was one of the most significant contradictions in his leadership. While Cromwell promoted religious freedom for various Protestant sects, he was staunchly intolerant of Catholics and Anglicans, viewing them as obstacles to the godly republic he envisioned. His policies towards Catholics, especially in Ireland, were brutal. Cromwell's military campaigns in Ireland resulted in widespread massacres, justified by him as part of a necessary effort to ensure the survival of the Commonwealth. These actions, while rooted in his belief in religious righteousness, led to profound suffering and division, leaving a legacy of bitterness that lasted for generations. Moreover, Cromwell's imposition of Puritan values on the broader population led to widespread resentment. His attempts to regulate morality by banning public festivities such as Christmas, closing theaters, and censoring entertainment were seen as authoritarian and oppressive. Although Cromwell's goal was to create a virtuous, godly society, his methods alienated large sections of the population. His belief in religious purity blinded him to the reality that a just society cannot be built through coercion and repression. Cromwell's religious intolerance, combined with his authoritarian political measures, underscores one of the key contradictions in his leadership: the pursuit of a moral, godly society that was built on the oppression of those who did not share his beliefs. This paradox highlights the dangers of ideological purity in governance, as it often leads to the erosion of basic freedoms in the name of achieving an ideal. Cromwell's death and the Restoration, a republic in shambles. Cromwell's death in 1658 marked an era for the Commonwealth, but the political stability he had hoped for was never achieved. The brief tenure of his son, Richard Cromwell, as Lord Protector, failed to maintain the political order Cromwell had established. Without his father's political savvy, Richard lacked the authority and support to hold the Commonwealth together. Within just 2 years, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, effectively undoing much of what Cromwell had worked toward. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 was both a personal and political repudiation of Cromwell's vision for England. The monarchy's return symbolized the failure of the Republican experiment, but it also highlighted the profound impact Cromwell had had on English political life. The very fact that Charles II's return to the throne was seen as a resolution to the political upheaval Cromwell had orchestrated demonstrates the lasting influence of his actions. However, Cromwell's death did not mark the end of his ideas. The Republican and constitutional debates he had initiated continued to echo in political thought, especially in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which led to the establishment of a constitutional monarchy. In this sense, even though Cromwell's immediate political goals were undone, his ideas, especially about the role of Parliament and the limits of royal power, laid the groundwork for later political developments. The monarchy that was restored was never the same as the one Cromwell had overthrown. It was tempered by the constitutional changes that would come in the centuries to follow. Cromwell's restless legacy, the cost of leadership and idealism. At the heart of Oliver Cromwell's legacy is the profound tension between his ideals and the practical realities of leadership. His desire to create a godly republic, grounded in Puritan values, led him to take unprecedented steps, but it also meant that his reign was marked by authoritarianism, military intervention, and religious intolerance. The quest for a godly society ultimately required sacrifices, both personal and political, that Cromwell could never fully reconcile. Despite his many achievements, Cromwell's life and leadership were marked by restlessness. He was driven by a vision of a better, more just society, yet his methods often led to division, resentment, and violence. His desire to create peace and stability for England was thwarted by the very actions he took to achieve it. The irony of Cromwell's life is that despite all his efforts to transform England into a more righteous nation, he was unable to find peace in his own heart, and his vision for England was never fully realized. His legacy is a testament to the costs of ambition and the limits of idealism. It is a reminder that those who seek to change the world often find themselves trapped in a cycle of internal conflict, moral compromise, and political struggle. Cromwell's life and legacy continue to provoke reflection on the nature of power and the human cost of leadership. His story is one of ambition, moral conflict, and the relentless pursuit of an ideal that could never be fully realized. In this, he serves as both a warning and a source of inspiration, a leader who sought greatness but paid a personal and moral price that left him forever restless. His legacy is a powerful reminder that the cost of transformative leadership is often higher than we anticipate, and the pursuit of an ideal society can sometimes leave us more divided and restless.
As we continue to explore the life and legacy of Oliver Cromwell, we move deeper into the heart of his contradictions, the way his actions, driven by ideals of justice and godliness, resulted in a legacy marked by oppression, division, and internal struggle. Cromwell's story offers a profound lesson in the dangers of unyielding ambition, the complexities of leadership, and the tragic consequences of pursuing a vision without fully recognizing the human cost involved. Cromwell's pursuit of a just society, ideals, and the reality of power. Cromwell's fundamental desire was to create a just, godly society, a republic that would be free from the corruption of the monarchy, governed by men who were accountable to God and to the people. His Puritan faith fueled this vision, which he believed was divinely sanctioned. Cromwell saw himself as an instrument of God, chosen to lead England into a new political and religious order. This deeply religious idealism gave him the conviction and moral clarity to take bold actions, but it also set him on a path fraught with contradictions. The very ambition that led Cromwell to challenge the monarchy and to create a republic was in itself a form of authoritarianism. His insistence on maintaining control over England through military force, his heavy-handed suppression of dissent, and his refusal to tolerate any opposition, whether political or religious, reveals the tension between his lofty ideals and the practical realities of wielding power. Cromwell believed that his actions were justified because they were aligned with a higher moral and divine purpose, but this often led him to disregard the personal freedoms and rights of those who did not share his vision. His belief in the righteousness of his mission became the lens through which he viewed all opposition, making it easier for him to dismiss dissent as heresy or treason. In his effort to create a republic based on divine laws, Cromwell failed to appreciate the potential for moral compromise in leadership. By using military force to maintain his vision for England, and by restricting the freedoms of those who disagreed with him, Cromwell inadvertently mirrored the very system he sought to overthrow. The monarchy he replaced was founded on centralized power, and in his own government, Cromwell enacted policies that increasingly resembled the very authoritarianism he had once decried. Cromwell's religious convictions, the strain of puritanical governance. Cromwell's deep Puritan faith was perhaps his most
As we approach the final layers of Oliver Cromwell's story, we are reminded once again of the indelible mark he left on English history and the profound moral complexities that defined his leadership. His life and legacy provide invaluable lessons on the fragile relationship between political power, moral integrity, and the price of transformative change. Cromwell's restless pursuit of political and religious ideals highlights the inherent tension between ambition and the personal costs of leadership. The final years, a man weary of leadership and divided by his vision. As Cromwell's reign wore on, the strain of leadership, both physical and emotional, became increasingly evident. The political, military, and spiritual burdens he carried weighed heavily on him, as did the internal conflicts between his divine calling and the consequences of his authoritarian rule. Despite the vision he had for a republic built on Puritan values, the reality of maintaining power and stability left him in a position where rest, both personal and political, was impossible. Cromwell's declining health in the years before his death reflects the exhaustion of being a revolutionary leader. His health deteriorated in part due to the immense stress of trying to keep the Commonwealth together while simultaneously managing the internal dissent and external threats to his rule. The burden of being a military leader, a political strategist, and a religious reformer must have left him emotionally and physically drained. His declining health also mirrors his internal struggles. The man who once felt divinely ordained to lead was now faced with the consequences of his decisions that included war, violence, religious persecution, and authoritarian rule. The sense of disillusionment may have begun to seep into Cromwell's thoughts as he reflected on the high cost of his leadership. In his final years, as the political landscape became more unstable, Cromwell may have questioned the price of the reforms he had implemented. His desire for political and spiritual rest remained unfulfilled, and the contradictions in his leadership between his ideals and the authoritarianism that defined his rule likely weighed on him. The restoration of the monarchy, the rejection of Cromwell's vision. After Cromwell's death in 1658, the Commonwealth he fought so hard to establish quickly began to disintegrate. His son, Richard Cromwell, was unable to maintain control, and within just 2 years, Charles II was restored to the throne. The monarchy's return signified the end of the republican experiment that Cromwell had championed. The events of 1660 represented not only a political setback, but a direct repudiation of Cromwell's ideals for a republic free from the monarchy. Yet, the restoration of the monarchy was not simply a return to the status quo of the past. The very fact that the monarchy was restored in a period of political instability speaks to the enduring impact of Cromwell's actions. His challenge to the monarchy, his assertion that the power of the crown should be limited by Parliament, and his brief experiment with a republic all left their mark on English political thought. The idea of a government that was accountable to the people and to Parliament, not just the monarchy, remained a crucial aspect of political discourse even after the monarchy's return. While Cromwell's immediate political legacy, his vision of a godly republic, was dismantled, his ideas about the role of Parliament and the balance of power between the monarchy and the people lived on. The events that followed Cromwell's death, particularly the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which resulted in the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, were a direct consequence of the political tensions Cromwell had introduced. In this sense, Cromwell's failure to create a lasting republic became an integral part of the process that eventually led to a more balanced form of government in Britain. Cromwell's execution and the attempt to erase his legacy. The restoration of the monarchy not only represented a rejection of Cromwell's Republican vision, but a concerted effort to erase his memory from history. In 1661, a posthumous execution was carried out on Cromwell's body, and his corpse was exhumed, hanged, and beheaded as a public symbol of the monarchy's victory over the Republican forces. This act was not just a political statement, it was an attempt to remove Cromwell's influence from the collective memory of the nation. His body was put on display as a warning to anyone who might dare to challenge the monarchy in the future. Yet, despite this symbolic act of vengeance, Cromwell's legacy could not be so easily erased. The very fact that such an effort was made to eliminate his memory suggests the enduring influence of his actions. The Restoration might have marked the end of Cromwell's republic, but his questions about the nature of government, the role of monarchy, and the power of Parliament remained alive in the political thought of the time. Even as his body was desecrated, his political ideals lived on, shaping the evolution of British governance for years to come. The irony, of course, is that in attempting to erase his legacy, the monarchy inadvertently ensured that Cromwell's influence would continue to be felt in English politics. The constitutional reforms that would eventually lead to a more balanced system of government, including the Bill of Rights and the eventual development of a parliamentary system, were built on the very principles Cromwell fought for, even if they were not realized in his time. Cromwell's restless legacy, the unresolved tension between ambition and morality. The most enduring lesson from Cromwell's life is perhaps the tragedy of his restless pursuit of an ideal society, a society based on religious purity, justice, and liberty, but one that was attained through methods that ultimately contradicted those very ideals. Cromwell was a man driven by a profound sense of moral duty, convinced that his actions were divinely ordained. Yet the very actions that were meant to establish a just society led to violence, religious intolerance, and authoritarianism. Cromwell's moral and political contradictions were not merely the result of personal failings, but rather a reflection of the challenges inherent in revolutionary leadership. The pursuit of idealism in times of political upheaval often forces leaders to make compromises that can undermine the very values they seek to uphold. Cromwell's story is a cautionary tale about the limits of idealism in governments. It shows us that the methods we use to bring about change are as important as the ideals themselves, and that the pursuit of justice, when driven by a singular, uncompromising vision, can lead to unintended consequences. Cromwell's inability to find rest, both personally and politically, is a reminder that even the most well-intentioned leaders can become ensnared by the very ideals they seek to promote. His failure to reconcile his belief in a godly republic with the authoritarian measures he used to implement it serves as a poignant reminder of the inherent risks of leadership, especially when that leadership is driven by personal conviction and ideological purity. The tragic irony, a leader who could not rest. Cromwell's restless pursuit of power, justice, and godliness is ultimately a story of tragedy. His ambition to create a better society, rooted in his faith and his belief in divine calling, led him to make decisions that would define his legacy. While he sought to build a republic based on religious and political freedom, his methods ultimately resulted in a government characterized by violence, suppression, and authoritarian control. Despite his significant achievements, Cromwell's inability to reconcile his ideals with the means he used to achieve them meant that he never found the peace or rest he so desperately sought. The restoration of the monarchy, the execution of his body, and the disintegration of his republic marked the final chapter in Cromwell's political career. Yet his legacy, marked by both triumph and failure, continues to provoke reflection on the nature of power, leadership, and the high cost of ambition. Cromwell's restless legacy is a timeless lesson in the complexities of leadership, the limits of power, and the enduring consequences of pursuing ideals without fully understanding the sacrifices they demand.
Oliver Cromwell's life stands as a monument to the complexities of leadership, the deep tensions between ideology and practice, and the human cost of pursuing transformative change. His story is not one of simple triumph or failure, but rather a tragic tale of a man whose unwavering ambition to create a better world ultimately led to contradictions, moral compromises, and a restless legacy. Driven by a powerful religious conviction and a vision for a godly republic, Cromwell sought to rid England of the monarchy and establish a new order based on justice, religious purity, and freedom. Yet the very methods he used to achieve this vision, military force, authoritarian rule, and religious intolerance, ran counter to the ideals he claimed to champion. In his pursuit of a just and godly society, he became entangled in the very authoritarianism he had once fought against, creating a system marked by violence, repression, and the denial of freedoms to those who did not share his beliefs. Cromwell's death did not bring closure to his vision, nor did it mark the end of the debates he sparked. His republican ideals were quickly dismantled with the restoration of the monarchy, yet the very fact that the monarchy's return symbolized a rejection of Cromwell's ideals highlights the profound impact of his actions. Though his republic was short-lived, Cromwell's ideas about the balance of power, the role of the monarchy, and the importance of parliamentary representation continued to reverberate through English political life. The paradox of Cromwell's legacy is that despite his transformative goals, he never found the peace he sought. His relentless pursuit of a better society was marred by the contradictions of his leadership, which left him unable to reconcile his ideals with the realities of political power. His failure to find rest, both personally and politically, underscores the high cost of ambition, the moral compromises of leadership, and the price of striving for greatness. In the end, Cromwell's life remains a powerful reminder that the pursuit of idealism in politics, while noble, can lead to unintended consequences. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, the complexities of moral governance, and the ways in which even the most well-intentioned leaders can become ensnared by their own convictions. Oliver Cromwell's restless legacy, marked by both heroism and tyranny, continues to provoke reflection on the challenges of leadership and the costs of changing the world, reminding us that sometimes the rest we seek may forever remain beyond our grasp.